The wind is soft tonight. You can almost hear it brushing against the leaves of an old temple hidden deep within the mist. Somewhere, a bell echoes, low, distant, like the memory of something once known, now returning. Welcome. You've arrived at the Empty Boat, a place between breaths where stories drift like incense and silence speaks louder than words. Here, we don't teach, we remember, not with the mind, but with the heart that has been broken and is still beating. In these stories, you won't find answers, only questions that bloom quietly in the dark and the courage to sit beside them. So settle in. Let the world outside dissolve. Let the mind rest like a still lake under moonlight. One by one, these 25 stories will meet you where you are, in your grief, your longing, your confusion, your search for something unnamed. And, perhaps, as the last story ends, you will find yourself just a little more here. Now, close your eyes or leave them gently open. Let us begin. Story 1. The Last Bowl of Rice. The wind came from the north, brushing across the pine forests like a forgotten lullaby. In the quiet village of Yukimura, tucked beneath the misty foothills of Mount Kasa, winter had arrived early. Snow did not fall yet, but the chill in the air whispered of its approach. The fields were already bare, and the old stone lanterns outside the shrine had begun to wear a thin coat of frost. In a modest wooden house near the riverbank, an elderly man named Saburo lit his final piece of firewood. His hands, weathered by age and labor, trembled slightly. The flame flickered, casting shadows that danced on the worn walls. Beside him sat a small lacquered bowl, a faded blue cloth, and the last cup of rice from a nearly empty sack. Saburo had lived alone since his wife passed, and his only son, Ryota, had moved to the city years ago. Letters had stopped arriving long ago. Time had slowed here, like the lazy current of the river behind the house. Yet the house still stood, and so did Saburo. He rinsed the rice carefully, using rainwater collected in an old jar. Each grain, to him, was sacred, each one shaped by the earth, the wind, and the hands of unseen farmers. As the rice boiled, he knelt by the window, watching steam rise from the pot like incense rising to the mountain gods. A soft knock. He turned. Standing at the door was a young woman. Her name was Aiko, from the neighboring house that had recently been rebuilt after a fire. In her arms she held a boy, her son Kenta. The child looked weak, his cheeks sunken, eyes hollow with fever. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The clinic is closed. I have no food left." Saburo's eyes did not change. He simply nodded and turned to the pot. The rice was ready. He poured it slowly into the lacquered bowl, carefully folding a cloth underneath so the heat wouldn't burn the boy's small hands. He knelt and placed it into Aiko's palms. She hesitated. "No," she said, shaking her head. "This must be your last." Saburo raised his hand gently. "No more words," he said. "The rice belongs to whoever needs it most." Aiko bowed deeply, holding back tears. The boy ate slowly. Steam rose to his cheeks, warming them. Color returned, ever so faintly. For a moment, he even smiled. That was enough. Saburo turned away from them and sat back down near the fire. His back rested against the wall. His breath slowed. His eyes remained open, fixed on the corner where an old painting of the Bodhisattva Jizo stood. That was the last time anyone saw him alive. By morning, the fire had burned out. Saburo was still seated, arms resting peacefully on his lap, chin slightly bowed. Aiko returned with tea and found him like that, silent, still, untouched by suffering. She did not cry, not at first. She simply sat beside him, holding her son close, heart full of something she didn't yet understand. Later that week, the monks from the mountain temple came down for the rites. One of them, an old friend of Saburo's youth, stood quietly as the incense burned. "He died giving," the monk whispered. "Some live their whole lives searching for the moment he found." Zen reflection. In Zen, the rice bowl is more than a vessel for food. It is a symbol of readiness, to receive what is given and to let go of what is held. The act of sharing a final meal is not a loss, but an opening. Saburo did not give away his rice because he believed in sacrifice. He gave because there was no more distinction between self and other. In offering his last nourishment, he stepped into the river of non-attachment. In the Soto tradition, monks chant before every meal. We reflect on the effort that brought us this food. May we realize the path of awakening. Saburo's offering was that chant made flesh. There was no audience, no recognition, just a warm bowl extended by a quiet hand on a cold night. That is the Dharma. Psychological reflection. Modern psychology often speaks of generativity, the stage of life in which an individual, especially in older age, seeks to give back to future generations. Saburo's action reflects a culmination of that instinct, yet stripped of ego or expectation. For Aiko, who came from a space of desperation and guilt, the act of receiving was just as transformative. Many find it harder to receive than to give. We often carry shame for our needs, especially in a world that rewards independence and punishes vulnerability. But Saburo's gesture broke that pattern. In trauma therapy, we learn that healing doesn't always come from confrontation or confession. Sometimes healing comes from being seen, fed, accepted, without conditions. Meditative ending. So tonight, take a moment to imagine your own bowl. What does it hold? Who might need it more than you? And can you give, not from abundance, but from awareness? Can you receive, not with guilt, but with gratitude? Close your eyes. Listen to the breath. Feel the warmth of a bowl in your hands, not just rice, but compassion shaped by simplicity. The last bowl is never truly the last. Story 2. The Monk Who Never Spoke. High in the Sorak Mountains of eastern Korea, where the mist clings to the pine trees like faded dreams, and the temples perch on cliff edges like birds resting mid-flight, there stood a monastery carved into stone. Baekryonsa, Temple of the White Lotus. It was not large, not wealthy. The buildings were old, their paint faded. Ivy crept along the wooden beams. The wind made music through wind chimes that no one had tuned in years. The monks who lived there did not welcome tourists, nor did they appear in photographs. It was a quiet place for quiet things. And at the heart of the temple lived a monk who had not spoken for over 40 years. His name was Jiwon. Or at least that was the name written in the old guest records. No one alive remembered when he arrived. No one ever saw him enter or leave the monastery grounds. He did not chant with the others, nor did he strike the morning bell. But he was always there, sweeping the same stone path at dawn, tending the bonsai trees, kneeling by the koi pond with his eyes half closed, as if listening for something deeper than sound. He never looked disturbed, never angry, never pleased, just still. Some believed he had taken a vow of silence. Others whispered rumors that he had once been a soldier, that he had committed a crime, that he was waiting for someone he loved, someone who never returned. But Jiwon offered no answers. He simply bowed when greeted and returned to whatever task he had been doing. Not many noticed him after a while. Not until the child disappeared. Her name was Hana. 7 years old, the daughter of a woman who ran a tea house at the base of the mountain trail. She often visited the monastery in spring to chase butterflies, to laugh in the garden, to feed the temple cat that only allowed her to touch it. The monks adored her. She called them uncles and left drawings on their altars. One summer afternoon, a sudden storm rolled through the valley. Rain came down like nails. Thunder growled through the mountains. By nightfall, Hana was missing. The search went on for 2 days. Villagers combed the forests. Police dogs barked through the night. No one could find a trace. The tea house mother broke apart. Her wails were so raw they made the monks lower their heads. On the 3rd morning, as the sky softened with gray light, Ji-woon rose before anyone else and walked into the forest. He did not take a flashlight or a map. He did not carry water or food. He simply tied his robe, bowed to the temple statue of Avalokiteshvara, and disappeared into the trees. 12 hours passed. At sunset, he returned, carrying Hana. She was wrapped in his outer robe, her arms clinging to his neck, her face buried against his shoulder. Her clothes were soaked and torn, her feet cut from thorns, but she was alive. She whispered one word again and again as she was taken from him. Safe, safe, safe. No one asked Ji-woon how he found her. No one dared. That night, he sat alone under the moonlight by the lotus pond. A cup of barley tea rested untouched beside him, the temple cat curled by his side. One young monk, Song-min, watched him from the shadows. He had always wondered about Ji-woon, always believed silence was a kind of escape, but now something had shifted. Later that week, Song-min gathered courage and approached the elder monk. He sat beside him by the pond and spoke quietly. "Why don't you speak?" Ji-woon did not turn. "Do you ever want to?" Stillness. "Were you afraid you wouldn't be heard?" The wind stirred the water. Lotus leaves trembled. Finally, Ji-woon lifted a single hand, palm facing up. And then he pointed, first to the sky, then to the ground, and then, softly, to Song-min's heart. The young monk lowered his eyes. He understood. Zen reflection. Words are not always the truest form of communication. In Zen, silence is not the absence of thought. It is the presence of awareness. The deepest teachings cannot be captured by language. They are transmitted through presence, through gesture, through shared space. The monk Ji-woon embodied this. By not speaking, he allowed the world to speak louder. The wind in the leaves, the crying of a mother, the heartbeat of a lost child. His silence was not retreat, it was receptivity. As the saying goes in the Zen tradition, those who know do not speak, those who speak do not know. But this is not a rule, it is an invitation to listen beyond the ears. Psychological reflection. In modern psychology, especially in trauma recovery, we understand that silence is a complex language. Some use it to hide, some to punish, but others, like Ji-woon, use it to listen, deeply, compassionately, without the need to fix or explain. For many, silence is terrifying. It confronts us with ourselves. But when silence is held with intention, it becomes healing. It allows grief to breathe. It allows anxiety to settle. It makes space for what was too overwhelming to name. When Hana whispered, "safe," again and again, it was not because of anything Ji-woon said. It was because in his silence, she felt seen. Not as a case or a tragedy, but as a small, scared human who needed holding. Sometimes, the most powerful healing doesn't come from being told we'll be okay. It comes from someone being with us in the moment we're not. Meditative closing. Tonight, sit in silence. Don't force it. Don't fight your thoughts. Just sit. Let your breath come and go like waves. Listen, not to music, not to the world, but to the space between. And ask, what would I hear if I stopped speaking? Who might I meet if I stopped trying to explain myself? Who inside me is waiting for silence to begin? Just listen. You are safe. Story 3. The Girl and the Broken Mirror. There was a house on the edge of the lavender fields in Provence. It sat beneath a cypress hill, shaded by fig trees, with blue shutters that had long faded to gray. Wild roses grew along the stone wall. The front gate never closed properly, but no one came that way anymore. Not since the girl stopped singing. Her name was Elise. 16, thin as a willow branch, and quieter than a snowfall. She had once been lively, racing through the rows of purple bloom, barefoot and laughing, her hair catching the wind like silk. Her laughter used to ring across the hills, carried by the bees and the breeze. But that was before. Before the boy who said he loved her left. Before the town whispered things they didn't understand. Before she stopped looking into mirrors. Now she stayed inside the house, curtains drawn. Her mother, Camille, brought her meals in silence. The villagers passed by with pity in their eyes, offering bread, flowers, but never the right words. Because how do you speak to someone who has vanished inside their own skin? There was only one visitor who came without asking. An old woman named Madame Séraphine. She lived in a stone cottage near the monastery and was known for her odd ways. She collected wind chimes, walked barefoot even in winter, and talked to birds as if they understood her perfectly. When she came to Elise's door, she didn't knock. She simply walked in. Camille said nothing. She knew better than to argue with Séraphine. The old woman climbed the narrow stairs and found the girl curled up by the window, knees to chest, arms wrapped tightly around herself. The room smelled faintly of lavender, dust, and something sadder. Séraphine said nothing. She pulled a chair beside the girl and took out a small round object wrapped in a handkerchief. Slowly, she unfolded it. It was a mirror. But it was broken. The glass was fractured into spiderweb lines. Some shards were missing. What remained reflected a fragmented world, disjointed, dreamlike. Elise turned her face away. "I don't want to see," she whispered. Séraphine smiled. "Good. This mirror isn't for seeing, it's for remembering." The girl's eyes flicked back. "Remembering what?" "Your face before the story they wrote on it." They sat like that for a long time. Outside, the sun shifted across the sky. Birds sang. Somewhere a dog barked. The world moved. Inside, nothing did. Finally, Séraphine leaned forward and placed the mirror gently on the windowsill. "Let it sit here, just for a day. Don't touch it. Don't look. Let it breathe." She left without another word. The mirror stayed there. 1 day, 2, then a week. At first, Elise ignored it. Then she glanced. Then she sat across the room and stared, watching the way the sunlight caught the cracks, how the shapes shimmered like river water. She began to wonder, could something broken still reflect the truth? One morning she picked it up. The reflection was strange. Her eye, then her nose, a twist of cheekbone, all scattered across separate shards. But something strange happened. She didn't hate what she saw. There was no judgment in the mirror, no accusation, just pieces. Each one soft, incomplete, honest. There was no single face anymore, just moments, glimpses. That night, she dreamed of her childhood, of her father lifting her into a fig tree, of her mother singing over soup, of running barefoot with the neighbor's dog chasing behind, of a time before the boy, before the shame, before the silence. She woke with tears on her cheeks. The next day, Seraphine returned. Without speaking, Elise placed the mirror into her hands. The old woman looked at her gently. "Did you remember?" Elise nodded. "And?" "It hurt," she said, "but it didn't kill me." Seraphine smiled. "Then it's working." Zen reflection. In Zen, mirrors are not for vanity. They are symbols of mind, clear, reflective, and non-judgmental. When the mind is still, it reflects all things truthfully, without distortion. But when cracked by desire, regret, or fear, it does not lie. It simply shows the brokenness within. The broken mirror given to Elise was not meant to restore her image. It was meant to undo it. In Zen, we don't seek to fix what is shattered. We learn to see the beauty in impermanence, to sit with it, to understand that the cracks in the surface let light in. As the Japanese aesthetic of wabi-sabi teaches, there is beauty in things worn, weathered, and unfinished. Psychological reflection. From a psychological lens, Elise's withdrawal was a form of dissociation, common in those who've experienced betrayal, shame, or public humiliation. The refusal to look in a mirror speaks to identity fracture. When the self feels contaminated, the body becomes a burden. Seraphine's mirror disrupted that cycle, not by offering clarity, but by validating fragmentation. Trauma survivors often try to get back to who they were, but true healing does not erase the past, it makes room for it. When Elise viewed her reflection in broken pieces, she was able to decouple her identity from the trauma. The parts of her before, during, and after the event were allowed to coexist. This is the essence of integration, not healing as erasure, but healing as acceptance. Meditative closing. Find a quiet space. Sit. Close your eyes and picture a mirror, not flawless, but cracked. Now imagine your face in it. Not perfect, not smiling for anyone. Just there. Can you sit with that image? Not to fix it, not to judge it, just to witness it. Because sometimes the most sacred act is to look at yourself without turning away. You are not broken. You are many pieces, each one sacred, each one enough. Story 4. The Husband Who Planted Plums. In the quiet hills outside Macon, Georgia, there stood a stretch of land that no one visited anymore. The fence was bent in places, the mailbox rusted, and the road leading in had nearly vanished under layers of moss and pine needles. But every spring the land came alive. Not with voices, not with footsteps, but with 1,000 white blossoms trembling on the breeze. Plum trees. Dozens of them, maybe more. No one had ever counted them all. They stretched across the field like a soft sea of snow, petals drifting through the air like slow rain. In the mornings, dew clung to the branches like teardrops. And when the sun rose, it lit the whole orchard in pale gold. People who passed by called it beautiful, but the man who planted it never called it anything at all. His name was Luther. He had lived on that land for nearly 60 years, in a weathered house that creaked in the wind and sighed through its floorboards. He was not a friendly man, not by any stretch, at least not anymore. Folks said he'd once been kind, maybe even joyful. That was back when his wife, Nadine, was still alive. But that was a long time ago. They had married young, Luther and Nadine, just 18 and 17. She was the only girl who'd ever made him blush. She loved to sing while she cleaned, dance in the kitchen with flour in her hair, and tie sunflowers in the fence during July. They had no children, though not for lack of trying, just none came. Still, for 21 years, they were enough for each other. Until the diagnosis. Pancreatic cancer, the kind that came fast and stayed hard. By the time the doctor told them, Nadine had already begun to fade. Luther couldn't accept it. He tried prayers, herbs, vitamins, juice cleanses. He even tried to sell the land to pay for some specialist in Atlanta. Nadine just smiled through her pain, as if to say, "Stop fighting, I'm already walking away." When the pain got worse, he begged her to go to hospice. She refused. "I want to die where I was loved," she whispered. And so she did. One morning in March, she slipped away in her sleep. Her head resting on his shoulder, her hand still curled around the edge of his shirt. Luther didn't cry that day. He didn't speak at the funeral. He didn't eat for 3 days after that. What he did was plant trees. The next morning, he bought 5 young plum saplings from the nursery down in Perry. Then 5 more. Then 20. By the end of the week, the neighbors had stopped asking questions. He planted them in straight lines at first, then in curves, then in circles. Some said he'd lost his mind. "Why plums?" the feed store clerk once asked. Luther didn't answer. But it was simple. Nadine loved plums. She loved their color, their tart sweetness. She said they reminded her of summers in her grandmother's kitchen, of sticky hands and jars cooling on windowsills. She once told Luther that if she could come back as anything, she'd come back as a plum tree, just to feel the wind again. So he planted them. Year after year, season after season. He dug in silence, watered in silence, trimmed in silence. He grew older. His back curved. His hands stiffened. His beard turned white. But the trees, they bloomed. And he never picked a single fruit. One year, a storm rolled through, a bad one. Tore shingles off roofs, split fences, uprooted trees. A few of the plums didn't make it. Neighbors came by to help him clean up. He refused. Later, a young woman from the county office came to check on him. She'd grown up in town, remembered hearing stories about the plum man. She knocked gently. He opened the door. Her name was Grace. She smiled. "Just checking you're all right, Mr. Luther." He stared at her. "I'm fine." She paused. "May I ask, why do you never pick them? The plums, I mean." He looked out the window toward the orchard. "Not mine to pick." Grace frowned. "But you planted them." He shook his head. "Planted them for someone, just waiting for her to come home." She didn't know what to say. But before she left, she noticed something odd. On the mantel above his fireplace, there was a single jar of preserved plums, dusty, unopened, sealed with an old ribbon. A note was tied around its neck, faded with age. She didn't read it. She didn't need to. The next spring, Luther didn't come out to the orchard. He wasn't seen on his porch. The mailbox stayed closed. Grace, now working with the hospice team, visited one afternoon. She found him in bed. He wasn't ill exactly, just tired, as if life had quietly stepped aside and said, "You've done enough." His breath was soft. His eyes were distant. She sat beside him, held his hand. "I've been watching your trees," she whispered. "They're beautiful." Luther smiled faintly. Nadine always liked white blossoms. A long pause. "You think she ever saw them?" Grace didn't know what she believed, but in that moment she said, "I think she was in every one of them." That night, Luther passed away in his sleep, just like Nadine. They buried him beside her, at the edge of the orchard. No big stone, just a wooden marker, carved with a plum flower. In the years that followed, no one touched the trees. But people came. Strangers mostly, travelers, couples, women with children, elderly men who walked slowly and cried for no reason they could explain. They wandered through the orchard as if they were entering a cathedral. And always someone would find a plum that had fallen, ripe and unbruised. They would eat it and weep. No one knew why. Zen reflection. Planting a tree is a slow form of prayer. Luther's orchard was not grown for harvest or profit or pride. It was grown as an offering to love that had no place to go. In Zen, this is known as selfless action, doing without seeking result, offering without expectation. The plums were not for eating. They were blossoms of memory, roots of grief, fruits of longing. In Japanese Zen gardens, rocks and trees are arranged not to impress, but to mirror the inner world. Luther's orchard was his mirror, branch by branch, showing him the passage of time, the seasons of loss, the return of beauty. He did not speak his sorrow. He planted it, and it grew. Psychological reflection. Grief, when left unspoken, must move somewhere. For Luther, it moved into the earth. Psychologists call this sublimation, transforming overwhelming emotion into something constructive. Instead of collapsing under pain, he created a living space for it, and by doing so, allowed others to find peace too. The refusal to pick the fruit symbolized his unwillingness to claim closure. For him, grief was not a wound to be healed, but a presence to be honored. Modern therapy often focuses on letting go, but sometimes the healthiest act is to hold on, gently, reverently, like a plum blossom you never crush. Meditative closing. What trees have you planted in your life? What grief have you buried, not to forget, but to remember with tenderness? Close your eyes. Imagine an orchard inside you. It's quiet there. There are trees. Some have never borne fruit. Some are heavy with what you cannot name. Walk through them. Pick nothing. Just listen. Let your heart rest among the branches. Love does not die. It changes form and waits like blossoms in spring for someone to remember. Story 5. The Prisoner's Light. There was a prison hidden in the Atacama Desert of northern Chile, so far from the cities that even the guards spoke in whispers, as if not to wake the ghosts buried beneath the sand. It was called La Piedra Negra, the Black Stone. Not because of any actual stone, but because, once you entered, it was said, the weight of what you'd done never left your chest. It wasn't a large facility. The cells were old, their doors rusted at the hinges. The windows were no more than slits carved into sandstone. Each day, the wind blew fine grains of dust across the yard until everything turned the same color, pale, colorless, forgotten. The man in cell 27 had been there for 12 years. His name was Tomás Rivera. He was tall, with hands that once built homes and eyes that no longer avoided the past. He never started fights, never spoke unless spoken to, and never smiled. Other inmates called him El Ladrillo, the brick, because he was unmoving, unreadable. His crime? No one asked anymore, but the guards knew. He had taken a life. Not in a fit of rage, not by mistake. It was calculated, cold, and he confessed to it the moment the police arrived. "I did it," he said. "There is nothing more to say." But silence is never simple. In his cell, Tomás kept few things: a pencil, a Bible missing several pages, and a notebook whose pages he never tore out. On the wall above his cot, etched into stone by a spoon, were tally marks. Years, not days. Each night, he wrote a single line in the notebook. Not poetry, not dreams, just facts. "Today, I helped an old guard carry the boxes. I lost my temper but didn't raise my voice. I watched a spider build a web across the window and let it live. He called them small lights, things that didn't erase the past, but maybe, just maybe, softened its shadow. Then, one winter, a visitor came to the prison. An old Zen monk named Daihan, traveling from Korea on a pilgrimage through South America. He had been invited to give a talk at the university in Santiago, but instead asked to visit La Piedra Negra. The warden, amused, allowed it. The inmates gathered in the chapel, curious and skeptical. The monk wore gray robes and straw sandals, though the desert wind bit through the cracks in the walls. He spoke slowly, in careful Spanish. "I am not here to forgive you," he said. "That is not mine to give. I am here to sit with you in the dark." No one clapped, but no one left. When he was done, he bowed and said nothing more. He stayed for a week. On the second day, he passed Tomas in the yard. The monk bowed. Tomas nodded slightly. That night, he found a folded note slipped under his cell door. It read, "Would you like to sit with me tomorrow morning? Just silence. No questions." Tomas didn't respond. But at dawn, he walked to the edge of the yard where the monk sat facing the rising sun. No cushion, no altar, just sand. Tomas sat beside him. They did not speak. The next day, he came again, and the next. By the fifth day, the other prisoners had lost interest. But something had shifted. Tomas no longer clenched his fists in his sleep. He began sweeping the corridor without being asked. He gave half his bread to an inmate who limped from an old injury. One morning, the monk finally spoke. "You carry a great weight." Tomas stared forward. "I deserve it," he said. "Perhaps," Daihan replied, "but the soul is not a courtroom." Tomas turned to him. "Do you believe in forgiveness?" The monk looked up at the desert sky, where a hawk circled high above the cliffs. "I believe in light. Whether you stand in it or turn away is your path." That night, Tomas wrote, "I sat without speaking, and the silence did not accuse me." It was the first time in 12 years he didn't end his entry with a period, just space, as if the sentence was still alive. On the final day of the monk's visit, Tomas walked with him to the main gate. "Why did you come here?" he asked. Daihan smiled. "Because this is where I knew someone still believed in darkness more than light." Tomas lowered his gaze. The monk bowed deeply, pressed his palms together. "You are not your crime," he said. "You are the one watching it." Then he left. The years passed. Tomas remained in La Piedra Negra, but something inside him did not. He began teaching other inmates to read. He learned to carve small wooden animals for the children of the prison staff. He tended to a cactus that sprouted through a crack in the yard. He kept writing. Each entry, still a single line. Until one morning, 12 years after he had etched his first tally, he wrote, "Today, I forgave the man I used to be." He did not expect the world to change, but the air felt wider, as if even in the driest desert, something had bloomed. Zen reflection. In Zen, enlightenment is not a sudden explosion, but the steady removal of illusion. It is not escape, it is presence. Not denial, but seeing fully without turning away. Tomas's prison cell became his zafu, his meditation cushion. The silence, his teacher. His notebook, his sutra. There was no monastery, no incense, no robes, and yet the Dharma lived there. The Buddha never promised that past actions disappear. But he taught that we are not bound to them. Each moment is a new beginning, not a dismissal of karma, but an opening to transform it. Tomas did not seek to be seen as innocent. He sought only to walk through darkness with a candle, and that is enough. Psychological reflection. Tomas's journey reflects the deepest arc of rehabilitation, internal transformation without external reward. In psychological terms, he moved from guilt, a crushing sense of "I am bad," to remorse, the soft, active engagement with one's past to build a more meaningful present. His practice of small lights is akin to micro-acts of reparation, a therapeutic technique used in restorative justice. It allows the individual to act from their pain, not to erase it, but to weave it into a new story. The presence of the monk was not catalytic because he gave answers. It was because he witnessed without judgment. And for many prisoners of their own mind, that is the first act of freedom. Meditative closing. Sit in stillness. Feel your breath. Now ask yourself, what crime do I still carry inside me? What part of myself have I sentenced without appeal? Place it in your hands. Do not try to free it. Just look. Because sometimes the prison door is not locked, only untried. Bell chimes like wind across dry stone. You are not what you've done. You are who watches it now. And that is where the light begins. Story 6. The Woman at the Station. At the edge of a forgotten town in Romania, where the fog hangs low even in summer, there is a train station that no longer runs. The tracks are rusted, overgrown with moss and nettles. The benches are cracked. The timetable board is blank, its glass long since shattered. No trains have stopped there in over 3 decades. No conductor has called its name over loudspeakers. And yet, every day, without fail, an old woman comes to wait. She wears a brown wool coat, even in the heat, a scarf tied under her chin. Her eyes are cloudy, but her movements are precise. She arrives just after dawn, carrying a small parcel wrapped in cloth and a folded wooden chair. She sits at the same spot, beneath the old station clock that froze at 6:12, facing the tracks that lead to nowhere. The townspeople call her Domna Lydia. Some say she lost her husband in the war. Others claim she waits for a son who vanished. Children, unaware of the weight she carries, sometimes laugh, pointing out how the train to nowhere is late again. Lydia never replies. She just waits. One morning in late October, a stranger arrived. He was young, mid-20s, with a satchel over his shoulder and a journal tucked beneath one arm. His name was Mihai, a journalist from Bucharest, working on a story about abandoned stations across the countryside. He found her there, as always, seated upright, staring down the tracks as if a whistle might echo through the mist at any moment. He approached cautiously. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said. "May I sit?" She nodded, barely turning her head. He unfolded a small stool and sat beside her. "I'm writing about places that were once full of life," he said. "This station, it has a story, doesn't it?" She didn't speak. He waited. Eventually she said, "Everything with a beginning has an echo." It was not the answer he expected. Over the next several days, Mihai returned. Each morning he found her already seated. Some days she would speak, others not at all, but she never left before noon. He noticed how she would unwrap the cloth parcel slowly each time, revealing a neatly folded boy's shirt, white, pressed, smelling faintly of lavender. She would place it beside her on the bench, as if saving a seat. The silence grew heavier with each visit. Finally, on the 7th day, Mihai asked gently, "Who are you waiting for?" She turned, her gaze direct but soft. Her voice, when it came, sounded like dry leaves stirring. "My son, Pavel." He nodded. "Where did he go?" She looked back at the tracks. He boarded the 6:12 train to Constanța, summer of 1989. Mihai paused. "That was before the revolution?" She nodded. "Just before." He understood the weight in her words. That summer, many young men disappeared, some trying to escape the regime, others taken, others silenced. "But no one saw him again?" he asked. She shook her head. No letter, no call, only stillness. Why come here? Because if someone is lost, they should know someone is waiting. That night, Mihai could not sleep. He kept hearing her voice. If someone is lost, they should know someone is waiting. The next morning, he searched the town archives. He found an old report, yellowed, smudged, incomplete. A teenage boy, Pavel L., suspected of aiding defectors. Last seen boarding a train toward the eastern border. Never confirmed detained. Never confirmed dead. Vanished. He returned to the station. "I read about your son," he said. "There's no official record of his arrest." Lydia looked down. "I know." "Then you think he might still be alive?" "I do not know what happened to his body," she said, "but I know his soul never left. Mihai didn't understand at first. But in the days that followed, he began to see the station not as a place of transit, but as a place of witnessing. Lydia wasn't waiting for a train. She was holding space. Not for answers, not for closure, but for memory. She had become a vessel, a still point in time. One morning, she wasn't there. Mihai felt a strange unease. He waited. An hour passed, then 2. Finally, just as the town clock struck noon, he saw a small boy walking along the path, holding the familiar brown parcel in his hands. The child approached and said, "She asked me to bring this. She said, she's tired today." Mihai unfolded the parcel. It was the shirt, but this time there was a note pinned to it. It read, "I dreamed last night that the train came. He stepped off, barefoot. He had no words, only eyes that forgave. I think he's already home. Perhaps I no longer need to wait in the cold. Signed, Lydia." She died 2 nights later in her sleep, peacefully, with a smile. They buried her beside the station wall. No headstone, just a plum tree sapling planted in her name. The tracks still rust. The clock still reads 6:12. But every spring the tree blooms white flowers, and someone, no one knows who, places a folded shirt on the bench. Zen reflection. Lydia's story is one of silent practice. In Zen, waiting is not always an act of desire. It is a form of meditation. Her vigil was not a refusal to move on, but a devotion to presence. She became the embodiment of the Zen phrase, "Sit quietly, do nothing, spring comes, the grass grows by itself." Waiting, in its purest form, is not passive. It is watchfulness without clinging. It is staying with the unanswered question without forcing an answer. Lydia did not seek justice, proof, or resolution. She sought connection across time, loss, and death. And through her stillness, she became a light for the forgotten. Psychological reflection. In trauma therapy, unresolved loss, often called ambiguous grief, is one of the most difficult forms to process. There is no closure, no certainty, only endless loops of what if. Many break under the weight of not knowing. But Lydia chose a different path. Her ritual, returning daily, placing the shirt, served as a containment vessel for her grief. By ritualizing her mourning, she gave shape to the shapeless. Her consistency became an anchor, both for herself and for others who could not name their sorrow. She didn't move on. She moved with. And eventually, her psyche found the permission to rest. Meditative closing. Who have you lost, not to death, but to disappearance? A friend who stopped calling. A parent who turned silent. A self you no longer recognize. Close your eyes. Picture a station, empty, and in the mist, place yourself there. You are not waiting for arrival. You are honoring presence. Sit, breathe, stay. Sometimes being there is the message. And the train? It may have already arrived in another form. Story 7. The Bowl That Never Emptied. There was a village near the base of the Annapurna Range where the wind always smelled of cedar and old prayer flags fluttered like faded birds in the air. Stone paths twisted between small homes with painted windows, and above them the mountains stood like sleeping gods, silent, eternal. In this village lived a beggar named Kiran. He was not old, not young, not poor, not rich. He owned nothing but a robe, a walking stick, and a bronze bowl. His hair was uncut, his feet calloused, his voice rarely heard. The villagers called him Bhikshu, though he was not a monk, and no one knew where he had come from. He never spoke of the past, nor did he ask about anyone's future. Each morning he walked the same path, bowl in hand, stopping in front of doorways. He never begged aloud. He simply stood, waited, bowed, and, if something was offered, rice, lentils, a fruit, he received it with both hands. Some gave, some did not. He never showed anger or gratitude. He would bow just the same and move on. To the children, he was a mystery. To the elders, a familiar silence. To himself, he was just walking. One spring, the rains came late. The fields dried, the river thinned, the goats grew sick. One by one, doors began to close when Kiran approached, first with polite excuses, then with silence, then with shame. Soon no one opened their doors at all. He still walked, still stopped, still bowed, but the bowl remained empty. Days passed. He grew thinner, but not bitter. Then, on the 7th day, something changed. A child named Sonam, barefoot and curious, watched as Kiran sat beneath the Bodhi tree near the monastery ruins, placing his bowl in his lap and staring into it, unmoving. "What are you looking at?" Sonam asked. Kiran blinked slowly. "The hunger." The boy frowned. "You mean your stomach?" Kiran shook his head. "No, the one behind it." That night, Sonam told his grandmother. She had once been a nun before arthritis bent her back. She nodded and said, "Ask him to come tomorrow." The next morning, Sonam waited by the tree. When Kiran arrived, he took his hand. "My grandmother says you can eat with us." Kiran followed. They gave him boiled potatoes and butter tea. He ate slowly, reverently. Afterward, the grandmother asked, "Do you still walk?" "I do." "But no one feeds you." "I am still fed," he said. "How?" He lifted his bowl and held it toward her. Empty. "In this," he said, "there is everything I need." She laughed gently. "An empty bowl doesn't feed a body." "No," he said, "but it reveals the hunger that cannot be fed with food." From then on, the grandmother invited him often, not just for meals, but to sit. He rarely spoke, but when he did, it was like dropping stones into a still pond. The ripples lingered. "Why do you keep walking?" Sonam asked one day. Kiran looked at the boy. "Because the road is always longer inside." Word spread. A few villagers began watching him from their windows again. Some reopened their doors. Some placed an apple on their doorstep before sunrise. One woman, burdened with grief over a lost child, followed him for 2 days just to feel the silence he carried. She said later, "His emptiness held more comfort than all the prayers I've said."
One morning, a merchant came from the city. He had heard rumors of a beggar with a magic bowl that never emptied. He was wealthy, skeptical, but curious. He found Kiran sitting alone by the river. "Is it true," the merchant asked, "that your bowl never runs dry?" Kiran looked at him and said, "It is always full." The merchant laughed, "But it's empty." Kiran turned the bowl toward the sun. "It's full of space," he said, "and space holds everything." The merchant frowned. "I offer you 5 rupees for it." Kiran said nothing. 10. Still silence. "Fine, 20 rupees. That bowl must be worth something."
Kiran smiled. "It is," he said, "but not in coin." That evening, the merchant left frustrated. But in the dark, he sat awake by his fire, staring into his metal teacup. It looked different now, not because it changed, but because he did. The bowl, of course, was not magic. It was dented, ordinary, older than Kiran's memory. But it had become something else. A mirror, a teacher, a companion that never lied. It reminded him each morning that he needed less than he thought, and that what he truly hungered for could not be chewed or swallowed. It could only be understood. Years passed. Kiran grew slower. His beard turned white, but he still walked. When people asked why he didn't settle down, he'd tap the bowl lightly and say, "Still listening." To what? Only he knew. When he died, it was under the same Bodhi tree, one hand resting on the rim of the empty bowl, a small smile on his lips. The villagers buried him nearby. They placed the bowl atop a stone pedestal, beneath a carving that read, "To the one who taught us to see what we carry." And for years afterward, travelers came to kneel before the bowl, not to worship it, but to hear their own hunger echo back. Zen reflection. In Zen, the begging bowl is not a symbol of poverty, it is a symbol of openness. Monks use it not to take, but to receive, without preference, without expectation, without pride. Kiran's bowl was empty because his heart was full. He walked not to gather, but to shed. In Zen koans, the most transformative questions are not answered, they are lived. Kiran's question, "What hunger lives behind the hunger?" is such a koan. The bowl that never emptied was never about food. It was about perception. He saw the emptiness not as lack, but as spaciousness. Not as void, but as potential. This is the way. Psychological reflection. Kiran's journey speaks to the deep human pattern of insatiability, the endless craving for more, whether food, praise, security, or meaning. His silence, his simplicity, and his emptiness acted as a mirror, activating what modern psychology calls projection. Others saw in him what they lacked or feared to face. His bowl functioned as a symbolic container, a Jungian image that held the archetype of inner wholeness. It was not meant to be filled externally, but to be held mindfully. In today's world of constant acquisition, Kiran invites us into a radical reframing, that fullness comes not from possession, but from presence. Meditative closing. Tonight, sit with a bowl in front of you. Don't fill it. Don't assign it meaning. Just observe it. Ask yourself, what am I trying to fill in myself? What if I stopped filling and simply noticed what is already here? The bowl is never empty. It holds everything you've forgotten to feel. Now, be still and listen. The bowl is never empty. It holds everything you've forgotten to feel. Now, be still and listen. Story 8. The Shadow Lantern. The lantern seller arrived just before dusk. He carried no cart, no mule, no fanfare,
Only a long bamboo pole slung over his shoulder, from which hung 8 small lanterns, each swaying gently in the breeze like fireflies caught mid-dream. The villagers had never seen him before, and yet, as he stepped onto the square where old men play xiangqi and children chase dogs barefoot, no one questioned his presence. He moved slowly, not from age, but as if he had all the time in the world. "Lanterns," he said softly, almost to himself. "Lanterns to see in the dark." An old woman asked, "Are they for sale?" He smiled. "Not quite. You borrow them." She laughed, thinking it a jest. But the man's eyes, clouded yet clear, shimmered with something neither cruel nor kind, just still. No one saw where he slept that night. No house took him in. No door reported a knock. And yet, at sunrise, he sat again on the same stone by the well, humming a tune no one could place. The head monk of the village temple, Venerable Sanjay, had heard of the stranger. On the 3rd morning, as mist still hugged the tea fields, he made his way down from the hilltop temple with a prayer in mind. He bowed to the lantern seller. "Peace be with you." "And with your shadow," replied the man. Venerable Sanjay hesitated. "I've heard you offer lanterns." The man gestured to the pole. "They are not what you think. These are not to brighten the path in front of you. They show you what hides behind." Sanjay tilted his head. "A lantern for shadows?" "Exactly. Most people flee the dark. Few ask what it has to teach." He offered a lantern, small and circular, its frame made of aged mulberry bark and rice paper. When Sanjay touched it, a strange warmth passed through his fingertips. Not heat, but recognition. That evening, Sanjay lit the lantern in his room. It cast no light upon the floor. Instead, the walls flickered with memories, images not his own. A child crying in a forest, a woman clutching her chest beneath a plum tree, a man screaming into a river. But then his own memories appeared. The day he struck his younger brother during an argument, the time he looked away as a beggar was beaten, the moment he lied to his dying master. He wept, and the lantern glowed brighter. Each night he lit it again. The images shifted, some repeated, others deepened. He began to speak aloud to them. "I see you now. Forgive me. Thank you for not leaving." His sleep improved. His spine ached less. The novices noticed he smiled more, even at the stubborn ones. But one evening, the lantern failed to glow. Sanjay panicked. He shook it, whispered to it, lit incense, prayed. Still nothing. At dawn, he rushed to the square. The lantern seller was gone. Only one lantern remained, hanging from the well's old rope. Sanjay retrieved it and brought it to the temple, placing it in the meditation hall. The villagers came. One by one, they sat before it. The butcher, the widow, the angry child, the man who drank too much and shouted at clouds. And each time, the lantern revealed their shadow, not as punishment, but as invitation. One day, a young girl came. She had lost her mother to fever, and her father had since drifted from home like smoke from wet wood. She sat silently, the lantern lit, but it showed only her own face. She cried, not knowing why. Later, the monk explained, "You've done nothing wrong, but sometimes the shadow we carry is the loneliness of being unseen." She nodded and returned often, always sitting with the lantern. Sometimes it showed only wind, sometimes nothing at all. But she began to write poems and leave them under the lantern. No one took them, yet they disappeared each dawn. Years passed. The lantern aged, its paper frayed, its glow weakened. Sanjay was now old. The villagers, too, had changed. The angry child now taught music. The butcher grew orchids. The widow laughed again. Before he died, Sanjay gathered the villagers. He held the worn lantern. "This was never magic," he said. "It simply reminded us that we carry what we do not see. But when seen, gently, without judgment, it softens. And from that softness, we remember how to live." They buried him under the old plum tree. The lantern was placed beside him, unlit. But that spring, a child swore she saw it glow just before sunrise. Zen Parable Interlude: The Mirror Beneath the Water. A student once asked his master, "How do I remove the darkness inside me?" The master took him to a pond at night. "Look," he said, pointing to the surface. "I see nothing," the student replied. The master dropped a single pebble. Ripples formed, then stilled. "Now?" asked the master. "I see the moon." The master nodded. The water didn't create the moon. It simply became still enough to reflect it. Your task is not to fight the dark, only to become still enough to reflect the truth beneath it. Philosophical commentary. What we run from does not vanish, it waits. Shadows are not evil, they are unloved parts of ourselves. Grief is a shadow. Anger is a shadow. Even ambition can be a shadow when fueled by fear. But when gently illuminated, not with shame, but with understanding, they stop clawing and begin to speak. The lantern in the story is a metaphor for inner reflection. Unlike tools that light the world outside, it shines inward. Most modern life encourages distraction, avoidance, or endless self-improvement. But true healing comes not from fixing, but from facing. To see your shadow is to hold your own hand in the dark. And in doing so, discover that what you feared was only waiting for your embrace. Psychological reflection. In Jungian psychology, the shadow is the part of the psyche we reject or hide, often because it was deemed unacceptable by parents, culture, or trauma. Yet the shadow contains not only wounds, but gifts, creativity, intuition, raw energy. By denying it, we remain split. By integrating it, we become whole. This story gently invites us to face the parts we've buried. Memory, regret, and pain, when held with compassion, transform into wisdom. Just as the lantern reveals pain without condemnation, we too can sit with our past without becoming it. Meditation, therapy, journaling, even dreams, these are all modern forms of the shadow lantern. Meditative closing. Tonight, sit in silence for 10 minutes. Not to silence your thoughts, but to listen gently to what arises. Ask yourself, what have I hidden that longs to be seen? Then light a candle, not to brighten the room, but to honor what appears. And whisper to it, you are welcome here. Even your shadows belong. Story 9. The Sand Between Our Fingers. In the sun-bleached village of Palitana, where the wind whispered through cracked monastery walls and carried the scent of incense and boiled tea, an old woman lived alone at the edge of the mango grove. Her name was Kamala. She was not a monk, nor a teacher, nor even someone the villagers often consulted. Yet every afternoon, children would sneak to the edge of her fence to hear the melodies of her sitar, and travelers, those who had lost something they could not name, would somehow find their way to her doorstep. Kamala spoke little. She tended to her small garden, gathered dry firewood from the forest, and spent most of her days sitting on the stone porch, running her fingers over old prayer beads that had long since lost their color. One summer, a young man arrived in Palitana. His name was Rafik, and he had walked from the northern province, past cities, rivers, and mountain ridges, carrying only a weathered pack and an unspeakable silence in his chest. He had left everything behind: his family, his career, the girl he was meant to marry, after the death of his younger brother. A car crash, a mistake, a late-night phone call that shattered the neat structure of his life. He came to Palitana because someone at a temple in Surat had told him, There's a woman near the mango grove. She won't fix you, but she will sit beside you until you can see again." That was all Rafik wanted. Not answers, not therapy, just a quiet place where his heart could ache in peace. When he arrived at Kamala's door, she looked at him only once, then nodded toward the mat beside her. He sat. No words were exchanged. That day, they watched the ants carry crumbs away from the base of the porch. At dusk, she handed him a bowl of rice and chickpeas. He bowed slightly. She said nothing. This continued for days. Sometimes, Kamala would hum an old bhajan as she trimmed her hibiscus plants. Sometimes, Rafik would help her carry water from the well. And sometimes, they simply stared at the clouds until night came. One evening, after 24 days of silence, Kamala handed Rafik a small pouch. Inside were smooth grains of sand. "Tomorrow," she said quietly, "you will come with me."
The next morning, before the sun rose over the temple domes, Kamala and Rafik walked to the riverbank. The sky was still wrapped in mist, and only the birds accompanied their footsteps. Kamala knelt and poured half the sand into his hands. "This is your grief," she said. Rafik looked down. The sand felt warm from her skin. "It is real, heavy, finite," she continued. "Now walk with it." She didn't say how far, she didn't explain the ritual, but Rafik obeyed. For hours they walked, up hills, through forests, across old stone bridges. With each step, the sand began to slip through the cracks between his fingers. At first, he tried to cup his palms more tightly. Then he tucked in his thumbs. Then he walked more slowly. Still, the sand escaped. By the time they returned to the river at dusk, Rafik held only a few remaining grains. Kamala held out her hand. "Where is your grief?" He looked at the nearly empty pouch. "Gone," he said bitterly. "No," she replied. "Felt." She took his hand and sprinkled the last grains back into the river. "You cannot keep grief," she said. "You can only carry it until it decides to become something else." Rafik sat down, trembling. "For years," he whispered, "I tried to understand it. I tried to make it logical. I told myself it was an accident. I read books. I prayed. But it sat in my chest like a blade." Kamala nodded. "Grief does not want logic. It wants presence. It wants to be held, not solved." Rafik closed his eyes, and for the first time since the accident, he allowed himself to sob. Not the silent kind, not the composed weeping of funerals, but the deep, guttural sorrow that shakes the bones. Kamala sat beside him. She said nothing. She did not offer him a lesson. She did not ask him to stop. When the stars emerged, they walked home in silence. Over the weeks that followed, Rafik stayed in the village. He tended to Kamala's garden, repaired the roof of her storage shed, and even began playing the sitar in the evenings when her hands ached from arthritis. He never asked her what she had lost. One day, as they sat under the banyan tree, Kamala began to speak. "I once had a son," she said. "He drowned when he was 9. Rafik looked at her, startled. "It was a river much like this one. I blamed the currents, the gods, myself. I stopped speaking. I moved here. People thought I had gone mad." She smiled faintly. "But one day, an old monk came to visit. He did not ask me to forget. He only handed me a pot of basil and said, 'Tend to this. Let something live.' So I did." She turned to Rafik. "Pain does not leave. It becomes the soil for compassion." From then on, Rafik walked through the village each morning, greeting strangers, helping elders carry water, playing sitar at dusk not just for Kamala, but for the entire village square. He no longer tried to fix his grief. He let it sit beside him like a silent guest. And slowly, it changed. It became patience when children cried. It became gentleness when strangers forgot their place. It became a soft ache in his music that made listeners close their eyes and weep for reasons they did not understand. Kamala passed away the following winter, during the long silence of the December winds. She left no will, no final letter. Only her garden, her sitar, and a pouch of river sand on her porch. Rafiq scattered the sand across the temple steps. Then he bowed and walked. Zen parable reflection. In a different time and place, a monk once carried a woman across a river during a flood. Hours later, another monk, still fuming, said, "You broke our vow by touching a woman." The first monk replied, "I left her at the river. Why are you still carrying her?" Philosophical commentary. We often try to hold on to pain, believing it gives meaning to what we've lost. But the act of gripping tightly only deepens our suffering. In Zen, grief is not something to be buried or removed. It is to be walked with, honored, and ultimately transformed through presence. Psychological reflection. Modern psychology acknowledges the concept of continuing bonds, where grief evolves rather than ends. Letting go does not mean forgetting. It means no longer trying to control what we feel. Like sand, our sorrow moves through us, sometimes slowly, sometimes in floods. And in releasing our need to contain it, we allow it to fertilize compassion, empathy, and wisdom. Meditative closing. Sit quietly. Breathe deeply. Breathe deeply. Imagine grief in your palms like warm sand. Feel it slip through your fingers, not because you reject it, but because you allow it to move. Now ask yourself, what have I tried to hold on to that was meant to pass through me? Story 10. The Gate of the Unseen Garden. In the northernmost hills of Kyoto, where the wind often forgot to howl, and even birds dared not break the silence, there lived an old man named Eita. He was not famous, he was not learned, he never taught at the temples. But they called him the gatekeeper, not because he guarded a gate, but because he was one. Visitors came from faraway cities, arriving on foot, leaving behind the maps and noise they once clung to. There were no signs, only a crooked stone path and a wooden archway carved with nothing but moss and time. Those who passed under the gate felt something, a loosening, a forgetting, a remembering. Eita never asked their names. He simply poured tea, looked them in the eye, and said the same words each time. You may enter, but you will not see the garden until you no longer search for it. The visitors always smiled politely. They believed he meant it metaphorically. They believed wrong. The tale of the garden that was not there. One spring, a woman named Naomi arrived. She had lost her son to a war she never agreed with. She had lost her husband to silence. And she had lost herself to a kind of grief that no longer cried out loud, but settled like snow on the inside of her bones. Naomi had heard rumors in a hospice waiting room. There is a place, far from Tokyo, a garden you can only enter when you stop looking. Something about that sentence haunted her, so she came. Eita welcomed her without a nod, without judgment. She was tired. She had forgotten why she was there, even as she stood before him. Still, he said it again. You may enter, but you will not see the garden until you no longer search for it. Naomi bowed, because that is what her mother taught her to do when she didn't know what else to do. He handed her a broom. And so her journey began, not in prayer or meditation, but in sweeping leaves that never stopped falling. Days of silence. Naomi stayed in a small guest hut behind the main path. It was modest, tatami mats, bamboo walls, no electricity. She ate what was offered, which was usually rice and miso. She spoke to no one, and no one spoke to her.
Each morning, Ita gave her a simple task: sweep, boil water, trim the wild moss along the path. He never once mentioned the garden. And yet, she searched for it every day. She peeked behind walls. She followed bird calls. She once even stayed up all night, hoping the garden might bloom under moonlight. But there was nothing. Just gravel paths, dry trees, a stillness so complete it made her doubt she'd ever known sound. She began to grow angry. "What kind of place lies to the grieving?" she muttered one dusk. The breaking. One rainy afternoon, Naomi approached Ita. He was pouring water over stones, the steam rising like incense from the earth. "I've done all your tasks. I've followed your silence. I've obeyed your riddles. But I see no garden. There is no peace here. There is nothing here at all." Ita looked at her the way one looks at a flame, not judging it, not worshiping it, simply witnessing it burn. Then he did something he had never done with any other visitor. He walked. Not spoke, not explained, just walked. Naomi followed. Through the back path, past the bamboo grove, up a ridge of stones slippery with moss, until they reached a wooden door embedded in a low wall, half concealed by vines. Ita placed his hand on the latch. Naomi felt her breath catch. At last, she thought, the garden. But the door was locked. He turned to her and whispered, "This is not the gate you pass through with your feet." And then he left. Naomi stared at the door long after he was gone. The long unfolding. Naomi stayed. She didn't know why. Something had shifted, but it wasn't something she could name. The anger left her. The questions faded. She began to rise with the sun, not to find the garden, but to sit beneath the same tree. She stopped searching. She stopped waiting. One morning, she watched a spider repair a torn web. The next morning, the wind undid the work. The day after, the spider began again. For the first time in months, Naomi wept, quietly, without need for comfort. It was not sorrow. It was not relief. It was returning. And then, on a day like any other, something happened. The garden appears. Naomi had fallen asleep on the steps of the hut. The afternoon light flickered through the branches like golden threads. When she opened her eyes, she gasped. The sky shimmered. The breeze carried a scent she couldn't name, jasmine perhaps, or memory. And before her, a garden. She hadn't walked. She hadn't crossed any threshold. But the trees were greener, the stones warmer, the air filled with stillness, not emptiness. Birdsong returned, soft and clear. Petals floated down from nowhere. She was inside it. And then she wasn't. The next blink of the eye, it was gone. But she smiled, because she understood now. It had always been there. The koan of the hidden garden. Later, Naomi approached Ita. He was stirring tea as usual. She bowed, not out of politeness, but gratitude. "I saw it," she whispered. "Only for a moment, but it was enough." Ita handed her a cup. "Once is enough," he said, "for those who no longer chase." Philosophical commentary. This tale presents the central Zen principle of non-seeking. The garden is not a physical space, but a shift in perception. The more we desire awakening, peace, or enlightenment, the more distant it becomes. When striving ceases, clarity arises. Ita symbolizes the Zen master, not a giver of wisdom, but a pointer beyond words. The gate represents the illusion of a threshold. We think awakening lies ahead, behind something,
But in truth, it is always here, concealed by the very act of looking. Psychological reflection. Naomi's grief made her restless. In modern terms, she experienced complicated mourning, an unresolved attachment to loss that consumes identity. The tasks Ita gives are metaphors for mindful repetition, allowing the nervous system to gradually regulate through grounded action. Silence, routine, and presence become the tools of slow healing. When Naomi stops striving, her nervous system softens. She moves from sympathetic arousal to parasympathetic state. In that space of receptivity, the garden reveals itself, not as an external reward, but an internal harmony. Let this question linger in your heart. What are you still searching for that is already present, waiting quietly for you to stop looking? Take a breath. Place your hand on your chest. Feel the warmth. Now, pour tea. Watch steam rise, and let that be enough. Story 11. The Sound Beneath Silence. There was a blind woman named Eloise who lived in a quiet coastal village in northern Bretagne, France. Her home was a modest stone cottage wrapped in ivy, perched just close enough to the sea that the sound of waves, day and night, was the backdrop of her life. She had been blind since birth, and though many pitied her, Eloise had grown to see the world in a different way, through vibration, through scent, through sound. She ran a small tea house, L'Infini, where travelers came not for the view, but for the calm. There was no menu. You arrived, you sat, and Eloise would prepare a tea for you, not based on your order, but on the rhythm of your voice, the tension in your footsteps, the silences between your words. Somehow, she always chose perfectly. One gray spring afternoon, a young man named Marcel arrived. He was 28, a software engineer from the city who had lost his mother the week before. He looked like someone holding himself together with threads, well-dressed, polite, but brittle. He walked in with careful shoes, paused for a long breath, and said nothing. Eloise heard the silence before the voice. She turned her face toward him and smiled. "You've brought a storm," she said gently, "but it's not the weather." Marcel said nothing. Eloise motioned him to sit, and she went to the back to prepare his tea. No one else was there. The clock ticked with a softness that matched the waves outside. She returned with a delicate clay cup filled with warm, smoked oolong with hints of fig and cinnamon bark. "This is for grief that hasn't yet found its name," she said, setting it before him. Marcel looked stunned. "How did you—" But he couldn't finish the question. His hands trembled slightly as he took the first sip, and something inside him exhaled. Not a sob, not a cry, just space. "I haven't slept in days," he said at last, "and when I do, I wake up feeling like I've broken some sacred law by resting." Eloise sat across from him but said nothing. He continued, as if the tea itself had unlocked the dam. "I didn't get to say goodbye. I was too busy. I told her I'd come next weekend, but next weekend never came. One phone call, and she was gone." Eloise's head tilted slightly, the way trees listen to wind. "And now," Marcel said, eyes fixed on his cup, "everything is quiet, but it's not peaceful. It's empty, hollow, and it scares me." Eloise finally spoke. "Would you like to go on a walk with me?" He looked surprised. "Now?" "Now is the only time I have," she smiled. So he helped her to her feet, and they stepped outside into the salt-kissed air. Eloise walked with a stick, but her steps were confident. She knew every stone of the path that led toward the cliffs. They walked in silence for a long time. Marcel wanted to speak, but didn't know how. Every word felt small. Finally, Eloise stopped near a jagged outcrop where the sea crashed loudly below. She turned her face into the wind. "Do you hear that?" she asked. "The waves?" "No," she said, "not just the waves. Listen again." Marcel closed his eyes. The wind howled, the surf boomed, gulls cried, pebbles shifted beneath his boots. "It's chaos," he admitted. "Is it?" she smiled. "Now listen beneath the chaos." He frowned but obeyed. Deeper, slower. He began to notice the rhythm, the breathing of the ocean, the echo of gulls returning, the inhale and exhale of wind. Beneath it all, a pulse. Then something happened. His breath matched the sea. Eloise spoke. "There is a sound beneath silence. Most people fear silence because they think it is empty. But true silence," she said, "is never empty. It contains the world." Marcel felt his throat tighten. "I've been afraid to be alone," he whispered. "Because in the silence, your pain echoes." "Yes. But if you listen deeply," she said, "you'll find that even pain has a music, and once you hear it clearly, you can begin to dance with it." They stood there for a long time, the wind unraveling the knots in his chest. He didn't cry, he didn't scream, he just breathed, fully, for the first time in days. On the walk back, Eloise asked him, "Do you know what the monks of ancient China used to do when a student was paralyzed by grief?" He shook his head. "They would send him into the forest, alone, with nothing but a bell, and he could only ring the bell when he finally heard something he could not name." Marcel looked puzzled. "Why?" "Because naming is the mind's way of avoiding mystery," she said, "and healing begins in the nameless." Back at the tea house, she prepared a second cup. This time it was white tea with lavender and lemongrass. "This is for the part of you that's already healing, even if you haven't noticed." As Marcel drank, a strange peace filled him. Not because he was fixed, but because, for the first time, he was willing to stay broken a little longer, willing to stop rushing. He stayed in the village for 3 more days. Each day he would walk the cliff path, then return for a cup of tea and a wordless sitting with Eloise. On the final morning, as he prepared to leave, he asked her, "How did you know what I needed? You never asked me a single question." She smiled, pouring one last cup. "You came here to listen," she said. "You just didn't know it yet." Zen parable. In ancient Kyoto, a student asked his master, "What is the sound of truth?" The master replied, "Take this bowl, walk to the river, and return when you have heard the song that cannot be sung." The student spent days by the river, listening to birds, to frogs, to wind, to reeds. One morning, just as the sun touched the water, he dropped the bowl into the stream by accident. It cracked, spun, and sang a sound so strange, so haunting, it pierced his heart. He returned to the master empty-handed. "I lost the bowl," he said. The master nodded, smiling. "But you found the answer." Philosophical reflection. Silence is often misunderstood as the absence of sound. But in the Zen tradition, silence is the presence of everything, undisturbed. In the absence of our habitual noise, mental commentary, anxiety, distraction, we meet the world as it truly is. And in that space, the deepest healing begins. We listen not to escape suffering, but to hold it in awareness, to dissolve its edges, to allow it to breathe. The sea does not apologize for its tides. Grief does not ask for permission to rise. And silence, when embraced, becomes a teacher more eloquent than any words. Psychological insight. In trauma psychology, silence can either be terrifying or transformative. For many, silence feels like a void, a reminder of abandonment, loneliness, or unresolved pain.
But when we approach silence with compassion and mindfulness, it becomes fertile ground for integration. Eloise's method of healing wasn't to speak over Marcel's grief, but to create a safe enough silence for him to hear himself. This parallels the modern therapeutic concept of holding space, a non-judgmental container where the client's truth can surface naturally. By inviting Marcel to walk, to listen deeply, and to taste slowly, Eloise used multisensory mindfulness to guide him back into his body. In doing so, she modeled what modern therapists recognize as co-regulation, the nervous system settling in the presence of another who is deeply attuned. Meditative closing. Take a moment. Close your eyes. Listen not just with your ears, but with your breath, your skin, your presence. Can you hear the silence behind the sounds? Can you feel the truth beneath your thinking? Let it speak, without words. You are not broken. You are listening.
Story 12. The Garden That Waited. There was a woman named Rena who lived on the edge of a quiet coastal town where the sea met the cliffs like an old promise never broken. She had inherited a weathered cottage from her grandmother, a house wrapped in ivy and silence, with a stone path that led to a garden no one had tended in years. Rena was 32, single, and worn thin by city life. The fast pace had burned through her like wind through paper. After a particularly heavy year filled with loss and anxiety, her father's death, a broken engagement, and a job that devoured her soul, she packed what she could into a small car and drove without telling anyone where she was going. She just knew she had to leave. She arrived at the cottage just before the rainy season. The wind smelled of salt and pine. The walls creaked like old knees settling. At night, the sea spoke in murmurs against the rocks. The garden behind the cottage was a wild tangle. Thistles had climbed over the rose bushes. Ivy strangled the plum trees. Stone lanterns lay cracked and forgotten beneath the grass. There was even an old koi pond, dry as a whisper. Rena stared at the mess and felt both sorrow and recognition. She too had been left untended. At first, she did nothing. She slept, she cooked simple food, she read books her grandmother had kept on Buddhism, tea, and the art of quiet. Her phone remained off. She began to hear her breath again. Her hands stopped trembling. Then, one morning, she stepped outside and whispered, "Let me try." She picked up a rusty rake and began with the leaves. Each stroke felt like clearing a small part of her own mind. The wind carried away her expectations. Her muscles ached, but it was the ache of something real. Each day she worked, just one corner at a time. She uncovered an old stone path. She found a wooden bench beneath a pile of brambles. She began to repair the koi pond, one stone at a time, even though there were no fish yet.
And slowly the garden began to breathe again. One morning, as she worked to clear a fallen branch, an elderly man stood by the edge of her fence. He wore a wide straw hat and carried a basket of pears. "You've stirred the spirits," he said with a smile. "This garden hasn't seen such care in decades." "I'm just cleaning," she replied, brushing her brow. The man introduced himself as Haru, a retired gardener who once helped Rena's grandmother. "She believed the garden knew things," he said it only bloomed when the heart did. Rena smiled, uncertain. "I'm not sure mine has bloomed in years." Haru nodded as though he understood something deeper. "Keep showing up. The garden will teach you." From then on, he would visit occasionally, offering advice. "Don't cut too quickly," he'd warn. "Sometimes a weed is protecting a tender root." Rena began to see the garden differently, not as something to fix, but as something to understand. She moved slower, observed more, listened. She planted herbs, basil, thyme, mint, because they reminded her of her mother's cooking. She trimmed the plum trees gently, whispering as she worked. She mended the broken bench and placed a small cushion there just for sitting. No phones, no thoughts, just breath. One day, she found a teacup buried in the dirt, cracked but still whole. She cleaned it, poured hot green tea, and sat beside the koi pond. She imagined her grandmother's voice telling her stories under the plum blossoms.
Something shifted inside her. She didn't cry often anymore. When she did, it came like spring rain, brief, soft, and cleansing. A few months later, as spring began to touch the edges of winter, a child wandered into her garden. His name was Kaito, a quiet boy from the town who had lost his father the year before. He watched her silently from the gate. "You can come in," she offered. He did, wordless. She handed him a small trowel. "Want to help me plant sunflowers?" He nodded. From that day on, Kaito came every weekend. He spoke little, but they understood each other. They didn't talk about their grief. They watered it quietly, planting over it lavender, cosmos, lilies. The neighbors began to stop by. Someone donated a bag of lotus seeds. A woman brought painted stones for the path. An old man donated bamboo to repair the fence. The garden, once forgotten, became a place where stories weren't told, they were shared in silence, gesture, tea, and growing things. And one day, when Rena walked out early in the morning, she found the first koi swimming in the pond. She blinked. She hadn't put it there. She asked Haru. He shrugged. "Perhaps the garden gave it to you, or perhaps someone else wanted to return the gift." She sat beside the pond, hands folded in her lap. The koi moved like a living poem, slow, graceful, golden. It was then she realized the healing had never been loud. It didn't announce itself. It arrived like moss, like dawn, like breath returning after a long sob. The garden had waited for her, and she, unknowingly, had waited for it. Zen Parable Interlude: The Monk and the Rock Garden. A student once asked his Zen teacher, "Why do you sweep the rock garden every day? It is always perfect." The teacher replied, "I do not sweep to make it perfect. I sweep to remember that it already is." Philosophical reflection. Rena's journey reflects the principle of shikantaza, just sitting, or more broadly, just being. She didn't arrive at the garden with plans or healing in mind. She showed up, quietly, and tended to what was in front of her. Zen does not demand that we fix life like a puzzle. It asks only that we see, fully with presence, and allow what is broken to be seen without judgment. The garden became a mirror for Rena's internal wilderness, and by tending to the soil, she slowly rerouted herself in life. Psychological insight. Trauma often leaves the psyche tangled like a wild garden, neglected, overrun, yet still alive beneath. The act of gentle, non-goal-driven attention, whether to a garden, to the breath, or to a small act of kindness, can begin to regulate the nervous system. Rena's recovery was not driven by productivity. It was grounded in repetition, connection, and silence. She engaged in behavioral activation, a therapeutic tool, but in a mindful, relational way. Healing arrived not as a task, but as an ecosystem rediscovered. Meditative closing. Close your eyes. Picture a garden, wild, waiting, your name on its wind. There is no rush to change it. Walk its path gently. Touch its leaves with breath. Plant nothing but presence today. And trust, something golden may return to swim in your silence. Story 13. The Bamboo That Would Not Break. In a quiet part of Gifu Prefecture, near the Shirakawa River, there lived a man named Akiro. He was known to his neighbors as the Silent Reed, a man who rarely raised his voice and walked as if not to disturb the earth beneath his feet. He had once been a successful architect in Nagoya,
But after the sudden passing of his wife from a rare illness, he gave up the city, the concrete, the steel, everything. He moved into a modest wooden house beside a bamboo grove and lived alone. Each day, Akira would tend to the earth, sweep fallen leaves, boil tea, and sit for hours watching the wind dance through the slender stalks of bamboo. Their movement comforted him in ways that people no longer could. It had been 3 years. Though his outer life was peaceful, inside Akira held a storm, a grief that clung to him like winter frost. He often thought of his wife's laughter, her habit of humming while folding clothes, her hand brushing his cheek as she passed behind him in the kitchen. These memories were both treasure and torment. One day, during the start of monsoon season, a young woman named Haruna appeared at his door, soaked from the rain, her hair matted to her cheeks. She had come from the village clinic where she worked part-time, delivering medicine to isolated residents. Her scooter had broken down nearby. "May I come in?" she asked, voice barely above the rain. Akira nodded silently and handed her a towel. He made tea while she dried herself by the small charcoal brazier. They spoke little. The storm spoke for them. When the rain stopped, she thanked him and promised to return with his tea canister, which she had offered to refill from the clinic's stock. True to her word, she returned the next day. And then she returned again the day after. At first, their conversations were minimal, about the weather, the mountain paths, the strength of this year's storm. But slowly, Akira began to open. Haruna had a way of listening that didn't demand, only invited. Her presence did not threaten his silence, it made space for it. One morning, while sharing rice porridge on the engawa overlooking the bamboo, Haruna asked gently, "Why did you come here?" Akira looked out at the grove. The bamboo swayed even though there was no wind. He considered his answer. "I lost something," he said. "I thought maybe I could lose myself too." Haruna didn't speak. She simply turned her gaze to the same bamboo, allowing the silence to carry its weight. Later that week, a violent typhoon swept through the region. The Shirakawa River rose nearly to the road, and entire fields were flattened by wind. Haruna, worried, climbed through the storm to reach Akira's home. When she arrived, she found the house intact, but the bamboo grove looked as if it had bowed to the sky. "They'll break," she said, peering at the bent stalks under the moonlight. "Too much strain." Akira shook his head. "They won't. That's the way of bamboo. It bends, but doesn't break." That night, they lit a lantern and sat in the center of the room as the storm howled around them. Akira made tea. Haruna told a story from her childhood about getting lost in the woods. For the first time in years, Akira laughed, just once, quietly, but it was enough to make Haruna look up and smile. When the storm passed, the bamboo stood tall again, as if nothing had happened. The next day, Akira spoke more than usual. He told Haruna about his wife, Ayame, how she had taught him to cook, how she loved camellias, how she had faced death not with fear but with kindness. "I kept thinking if I stayed quiet enough, the pain would leave," he said, "but it didn't. It just changed shape." Haruna, moved, reached into her satchel and pulled out a small, worn booklet. It was a collection of Zen sayings she kept with her. She turned to one page and read, "A tree that is unbending is easily broken. The bamboo, which bends with the wind, is stronger than the oak." Akira looked at her, eyes glistening. "I thought strength was silence," he said. "Maybe strength," Haruna replied, "is the courage to sway." That afternoon, they walked through the grove together. Akira touched one of the bamboo stalks, running his hand along its smooth surface. "It's hollow," he said. Haruna nodded. "That's what makes it resilient. It lets the wind pass through." Akira paused. "Maybe I need to become more like bamboo." Haruna smiled. "Then you already have. You bent, but you didn't break." From that day forward, something shifted. Akira began to join the villagers in seasonal rituals. He repaired the old bridge that had fallen into disrepair. He even helped build a small tea house at the edge of the bamboo forest, where Haruna hosted monthly gatherings for locals to sit, talk, and simply breathe. The house that once held only silence now echoed with stories, laughter, and sometimes tears. Akira still missed Ayame. That never changed. But the pain had softened, as if the bamboo wind had passed through it and carried part of it away. Years later, when Haruna moved to Kyoto to continue her studies in hospice care, Akira gave her a hand-carved flute made from bamboo. "Keep it," he said, placing it in her hands. "Let it remind you to sway." She held it to her chest. "And you?" she asked. Akira looked out at the grove. "I'll keep bending." A student once asked the master, "How do I overcome sorrow?" The master took him to the bamboo grove. "Watch," the master said. The wind blew. The bamboo bent low, nearly touching the earth. "See," the master whispered. "Even in the fiercest storm, the bamboo does not resist. It yields. That is how it survives." This story reminds us that grief, sorrow, and emotional storms are inevitable. Resistance, though natural, can harden us, make us brittle. True strength often lies in our ability to feel fully and remain open. Like bamboo, we must be both rooted and flexible, anchored in being, yet willing to move with the impermanence of life. In psychological healing, rigidity is often linked with trauma responses, shutting down, denial, emotional numbing. Grieving fully, sharing with another, and allowing support are acts of flexibility and connection. Akira's transformation from isolation to engagement mirrors the human capacity to metabolize grief through safe relational presence. Tonight, as you sit quietly, ask yourself, where in your life are you trying to stand too firm? What if, instead, you allowed yourself to bend, just slightly, and let the wind pass through? Close your eyes. Take a breath as deep as the roots of the bamboo. Let go with the exhale. And remember, you are not broken. You are bending. Story 14. The Garden Without Walls. There was once a man named Hiroshi who lived on the eastern coast of a wind-kissed island. He had inherited a small house with a garden from his grandfather, a stern and silent fisherman who had spent his last years planting fruit trees and stones into symmetrical patterns, as if the tide of his mind needed order before the final departure. Hiroshi was not like his grandfather. Where the old man loved routine and silence, Hiroshi adored books, voices, and the shimmering complexity of other people. After retiring early from his job as a literature professor, he chose to live alone in the house, not out of solitude, but as a gesture of gratitude to the land his grandfather once touched. The garden, however, troubled him. It was beautiful, yes, but enclosed. A stone wall circled it, shoulder-high, covered in moss and lichen. Some said the wall had stood for 2 centuries, built by monks to protect a temple that no longer existed. Others whispered that the wall kept something in, rather than keeping others out. Hiroshi, with his gentle intellect and curious soul, believed neither. But over time, the wall began to weigh on him, not physically, but spiritually. The garden bore ripe plums, camellias, and bamboo. Birds sang. The moonlight draped over the stones like silk. Yet he felt caged. One morning, while sipping tea, Hiroshi asked aloud to no one in particular, "Why must a garden have borders to be beautiful?" A wind stirred the cherry blossoms, and that question would become a koan he could not release. He began his days in contemplation. He sat in the garden and watched how shadows moved across the wall. He imagined the conversations that might happen on the other side. Children laughing, old women gossiping, a passing priest reciting verses. He tried to climb the wall once, but an old injury in his knee reminded him of his age.
Another time, he tried to dig under it, but stopped halfway, ashamed. What was he really looking for? So instead, Hiroshi invited others into the garden. He hosted reading circles, tea ceremonies, and silent meditation gatherings. People came from the village and neighboring islands. They complimented the flowers, the balance of stones, the serenity. But no one ever mentioned the wall. Until a child did. A girl no older than 10 tugged on Hiroshi's sleeve one afternoon and asked, "Why is the garden locked up? Is something scary out there?" He looked at her for a long time, then answered, "No, my dear. What's scary is what we hide from ourselves." The child didn't understand, but Hiroshi did. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat with the question like it was a sleeping cat on his lap, warm, heavy, impossible to ignore. The next morning, Hiroshi made a decision. He would remove a section of the wall. Not tear it down, just open a path, a doorway, a gesture. He invited a young stonemason named Kenji from the northern village. Kenji arrived with tools and reverence, understanding that this was not merely a task, but a ritual. "Are you sure?" Kenji asked. "It is very old." "I'm older," Hiroshi smiled, "and heavier with what I've not let in." It took 2 days. When the final stone was removed and the first ray of light from the other side flooded through, Hiroshi cried. Not loudly, just a tear, just enough to taste the salt of release. Outside, there was nothing threatening, just a field of tall grass, a bird hopping, a breeze carrying the scent of rain. But something shifted inside him. In the days that followed, people noticed the change. Strangers walking by would peer into the garden and see Hiroshi sipping tea. Some would wave. A few entered. Others simply sat by the opening, resting. And over time, the garden became a passage rather than a destination. Butterflies flew in and out. A stray dog made it his home. A musician from Kyoto wandered in, played a flute at sunset, then left without saying a word. No one took anything, but something was always left behind. Laughter, stories, presents. One day, Hiroshi received a letter in the mailbox by the gate. It was unsigned. It read, "Your garden is not a place anymore. It is a gesture. Thank you for opening what you did not need to." That night, Hiroshi sat under the plum tree and thought of his grandfather. He imagined the man watching him from somewhere unseen, perhaps disapproving of the hole in the wall, but perhaps also, for once, smiling. He looked around the garden. Nothing had been destroyed, and yet everything had changed. Then, as if summoned, a monk appeared at the edge of the opening. He wore no shoes, carried no staff, and said nothing, but Hiroshi welcomed him in. They sat. Silence passed between them like an ancient river. Finally, the monk spoke. "There is a Zen tale," he said softly, "of a master who tended a perfect garden surrounded by high walls. One day, a storm broke the wall, and a thief wandered in. The master said to him, 'Take what you wish, but leave the silence.' The thief took nothing, and stayed for years." Hiroshi bowed. "I've never heard that story." The monk smiled. "It has not yet been written." They both laughed. As seasons passed, the garden continued to evolve. Hiroshi aged, but not alone. Children played tag along the stone path. Artists painted. A young woman once proposed to her partner beside the koi pond. The man cried and said yes. The garden became a sanctuary for those who needed nothing but space. And Hiroshi, now white-haired, slower, yet lighter, understood what had always eluded him. Beauty does not require control. Love does not require possession. Peace does not require protection. One day, in his final spring, Hiroshi sat by the doorway. The plum blossoms had just begun to fall, like pink snow in reverse. He took a breath and whispered to the wind, Let there be no more walls. Zen parable, the doorless gate. In a monastery atop a hill, a student asked the master, "Why do we sit in silence each day?" The master replied, "To hear the gate open." "But there is no gate." The master smiled. "Then listen harder." Philosophical commentary. We spend our lives building walls, mental, emotional, cultural. We think they protect us, define us, give shape to our existence, but often they simply isolate. True wisdom isn't in constructing better defenses, but in opening quiet doorways in our hearts. As Hiroshi's garden became more open, it became more alive, more complete. A garden without walls is not exposed, it is connected. It breathes. In Zen, the wall is never outside, it is in the mind. Psychological reflection. Trauma often builds walls to survive, to contain, to control. But healing does not happen in fortresses. It happens in connection, vulnerability, and surrender. The act of removing the wall in therapy mirrors the same transformation, allowing others in, allowing pain to be witnessed, and accepting the uncertainty of openness. Hiroshi's journey is not just physical, it is archetypal. The journey from defended loneliness to spacious intimacy, from control to communion. We do not lose ourselves by opening, we discover we were never alone. Meditative closing. Tonight, as you lie down, imagine a garden. Feel the earth beneath your feet. See the blossoms bloom without effort. Now, find the wall. Is it tall, thick, moss-covered? Gently open a space in it. Let the wind through, let the stars enter, let someone unexpected walk in. And then ask yourself, what have I been protecting? What am I now willing to welcome? Where can I let silence enter without closing the gate? Breathe. Let go. You are already home. Story 15. The Sound of the One-String Koto. In the quiet foothills of Aso, where the mists descend like breath from an unseen mouth, there lived an old koto maker named Haru. He had been born into a lineage of instrument crafters, men who shaped sound out of silence, turning wood and wire into weavings of music. But Haru was the last. His sons had left for the cities long ago, and his fingers, once nimble and sure, now trembled slightly as they carved. Each morning, Haru sat cross-legged by the sliding door of his workshop, facing the plum trees. He watched the petals drift and fall. He did not count the hours, only the way light curved against the grain of aged cedar. There, in that solitude, he continued to make kotos, long, curved instruments with 13 strings that sang the history of Japan. But for the last 3 years, no one came to buy them. One day, a young monk from a nearby monastery came down the winding stone path and bowed before Haru's open doorway. He introduced himself as Kisho, a student of Zen, and said he had heard stories about the old man who could make kotos weep. He asked if he could watch Haru work. Haru gave no answer, but motioned for the boy to sit. Day after day, Kisho returned. He brought rice cakes and tea. He swept the old man's workshop without being asked. He asked no more questions, but simply watched the slow dance of Haru's hands across lacquered wood. Sometimes they would sit in complete silence for hours, the old man sanding the bridge of the instrument, the boy watching the dust rise like incense. After a month, Haru finally spoke. "You have no interest in music," he said without looking up. Kisho smiled. "No, Master Haru, but I wish to learn about emptiness, and they say you carve sound from it." The old man gave a thin chuckle. "Emptiness? Then you're looking in the wrong place. I only carve wood." But the next day, Haru placed an unfinished koto before Kisho. It had only 1 string. "Play it," he said.
Kisho looked startled, but it's incomplete. Haru's gaze didn't waver. Play. So the monk plucked the string. A soft, singular note rang out, then another. He tried moving his fingers, pressing along the length of it. The tones shifted, shimmered even, but it felt barren. "There is nothing to this," Kisho said. "It feels like less than music." Haru's voice was like wind through reeds. "But you heard it, didn't you?" "Yes, but then the emptiness gave you something, even if it's not what you expected."
That night, Kisho lay awake in the monastery, the sound of the one-string note echoing in his memory. It was true. Something about it had haunted him. It had not filled the room like a symphony, but it had pierced something within him, as if its simplicity left no room to hide. Over the next week, Haru taught Kisho nothing about chords or scales. Instead, he asked the boy to walk the mountain paths and listen to the forest. "Come back when you can tell me the difference between the wind in bamboo and the wind in pine." Kisho obeyed. He sat under trees for hours, listening with a furrowed brow. At first, he heard only wind. But over time, he began to notice the texture of silence between sounds. Bamboo rattled softly, like chimes of bone. Pine whispered in long, hollow moans. The world, it turned out, was full of notes, if one stopped trying to categorize them. When he returned, Haru handed him the one-string koto again. "Play not to make music," he said. "Play to hear what's already there." Kisho plucked. And this time, the string did not sound empty. It sang. It sang not because it was complete, but because Kisho had stopped demanding it to be something else. He played slower. Each note rang like a drop of water falling into an ancient well. In that small sound was vastness, unspeakable, unknowable. Haru nodded once. "You're beginning to listen." That winter, the snow fell early and thick. The path to Haru's home vanished for days at a time. When Kisho finally made his way through the drifts, he found the door slightly open and the scent of incense curling through the air. Haru was gone. In his place was a final gift, the one-string koto, polished and complete, still with only one string. Beside it was a small note in brushstroke ink. "The more you remove, the more the truth can be heard." Kisho returned to the monastery carrying that one-string koto like it was a sacred sutra. He played it not for concerts or temple services, but in the early dawn, while the others still slept. He played it for the wind and the stillness and the questions that could not be answered in words. Years later, when he became abbot, he kept it in his chamber. When young monks complained of distractions or the complexities of life, he would hand it to them and say, "Play, listen, empty yourself." And though many frowned at its simplicity, a few would pluck the string and fall silent, and something in their eyes would change. Zen parable within the story. In ancient China, a master once gave his student a bowl with a hole at the bottom. When the student tried to fill it with tea, it leaked. The student asked, "Why do you give me something broken?" The master replied, "So that you learn not to hold on to anything." Philosophical reflection. In a world that praises complexity, fullness, and volume, we forget that truth often lives in what is missing. The one-string koto becomes a metaphor for life itself. We chase more status, more answers, more noise, only to realize we've built walls around the very silence that could free us. The single note, when played without ego, becomes a doorway. The emptiness between sounds becomes a home. And in reduction, we find revelation. To live fully is not to possess many things, but to deeply experience one. Psychological insight. From a therapeutic view, the one-string koto represents mindfulness, returning to a single point of awareness without judgment.
Many people suffer not because life is lacking, but because they cannot accept its simplicity. The inner critic often demands a symphony when a soft hum would heal. Minimalist practices in psychology, such as breathwork or single-point focus, are not about deprivation. They are about presence. In a distracted, hyper-stimulated age, learning to attend to one note, one breath, or one emotion becomes an act of inner revolution. The string does not need more. We need less. Meditative closing. Sit quietly for a moment. Imagine a single string stretched between your breath and the sky. Gently pluck it with your attention. Let it hum. Let it be enough. Better to hear the sound of one drop than to chase the roar of 1,000 waves. Zen saying.
Story 16. The Lantern and the Storm. It was late autumn when May arrived at the monastery on the mountain. She was not a monk, not a pilgrim, not even a believer, just a woman carrying a burden too heavy to hold alone. She walked for days through mist and moss, her boots soaked and her breath shallow, guided only by stories she half remembered, of a monk who never judged, who listened like water listens to stone, and who lit lanterns for those who had lost their way. When she reached the gate, the wind was rising. The trees whispered warnings in a language only the grieving could hear. May knocked, once, then twice. A young monk opened the door, bowed without words, and motioned her in. She didn't speak that first night, nor the second. She simply sat by the hearth, a silent silhouette, hands resting on a cup of ginger tea she never drank. The monks did not press. They moved around her gently, as if she were a sleeping animal they dared not disturb. It was on the third morning that the old master appeared. He wore no robes of authority. His hair, thin and silver, was tucked behind one ear like a child's. His face was ordinary, wrinkled like dry riverbeds, marked with sun and rain and long hours of silence. Yet something about him held weight, the kind that made May lower her eyes. "You are soaked in sorrow," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "Would you like to put it down, even for a moment?" May tried to answer, but no sound came. Instead, she pulled something from her satchel, a photograph curled and worn. It showed a young boy, laughing, arms flung out wide like wings. On the back, in fading ink, Leo, age 8, forever flying. The master said nothing, only placed the photo beside the hearth, where its edges curled with heat. "I was his mother," she whispered. "I still am. I don't know how to be anything else." The master nodded. "When the river overflows, we cannot pretend the flood didn't come, but we can learn how to build a raft." "I don't want a raft," she said bitterly. "I want him back." "Of course you do," the master replied. "That's love." Silence settled between them like snow. Finally, the master rose. "Walk with me." They stepped outside into the thin morning air. Frost glittered on the stone steps. May followed the master through the monastery garden, past fallen leaves and sleeping koi, until they reached a shed. He handed her an unlit lantern. "Tonight, a storm will come, strong winds, rain heavy enough to bend bamboo. This lantern," he tapped its wooden frame, "must stay lit through the night." May frowned. "In the storm?" "Yes." "Outside?" He smiled gently. "Where the wind lives." She almost laughed, almost. "Is this a lesson? A metaphor?" "No," he said. "It's just a lantern, and a storm." So that night, as rain began to fall, May found herself outside on the temple grounds, crouched beneath a makeshift shelter of wood and canvas, holding a trembling lantern whose flame flickered like a dying heartbeat. The storm came as promised. It roared through the valley, flung branches like spears, howled like wolves mourning the moon. May wrapped her arms around the lantern, shielding it with her body.
The wind clawed at her sleeves. Rain soaked her back. Her muscles ached. Her breath came in gasps. The flame nearly died again and again. But she did not let go. And when the first light of dawn crept over the ridgeline, she was still there, mud-streaked, shivering, soaked through. But the lantern, impossibly, was still lit. The master appeared beside her like mist. "You kept it alive," he said. "I don't know how," she replied hoarsely. "Because you decided it mattered." She looked at him then, really looked, eyes swollen but sharp. "You think grief is like this lantern, don't you?" He shook his head. "No, grief is the storm, but love is the flame." She wept then, not the wild sobs of a woman broken, but the quiet tears of someone who has finally been seen. Over the next days, May stayed at the monastery. She began to help in the kitchen, cleaning rice, chopping roots. She swept the garden paths. She sat in morning meditation. Each movement became a thread, slowly weaving her back into the fabric of the world. One afternoon, the master found her by the old stone bench, mending a torn sleeve. "Tell me about Leo," he said. She hesitated. Then, he had a crooked tooth, hated raisins, loved foxes, wanted to be an astronaut and a poet and a chef. The master smiled. A poet who cooks in space, that would have been something. She laughed, truly laughed for the first time in months. "Can I show you something?" she asked, reaching into her coat. She pulled out the photograph again, but now, tucked behind it, was a folded piece of paper. She handed it to the master. It was a drawing, a fox with a chef's hat floating among stars, holding a spatula and a tiny book of poems. "I drew it last night," she said, eyes soft. "He would have loved it." The master bowed his head. And perhaps he still does. Weeks passed. May no longer sat alone by the hearth. She laughed with the monks, helped fix a broken fence, even led a meditation session for visiting pilgrims. But one morning, as the cherry blossoms began to fall, she came to the master with her bag packed. "I think it's time." He did not try to stop her. Instead, he handed her something wrapped in cloth. She opened it. The lantern. "I thought it belonged to the temple," she said, touched. "It does," he replied, "but the flame belongs to you." That night, as she walked down the path that led from the mountain, lantern in hand, May did not cry. She did not tremble. She did not look back. And far behind her, where the storm once howled, the monastery stood silent and still, its windows lit with the quiet strength of 1,000 tiny flames. Zen Parable Reflection. A student once asked a Zen master, "Master, how do I let go of the pain I carry?" The master pointed to the lantern. "Do not let go," he said. "Carry it gently until it becomes light." Philosophical commentary. Grief is often misunderstood as something to get over. But grief, in its deepest form, is an act of devotion. To grieve is to remember, to honor, to carry love forward even when its object is gone. In Zen, we learn that the storm is not the enemy. It is the nature of impermanence, the unfolding of all things. Yet, even within the storm, the lantern can burn. That lantern is presence, compassion, and the quiet endurance of the heart. Psychological reflection. Modern psychology recognizes the need for symbolic acts in the healing process. Holding the lantern in the storm became May's rite of passage, a lived metaphor that turned passive grief into active care. Trauma freezes us in time. Ritual reawakens our agency. May's transformation began not when she let go of Leo, but when she allowed herself to feel love again, not as a memory, but as a living act. Creativity, ritual, community, and nature, these are the medicines the mind and heart both need. Meditative closing. Tonight, light a candle. Place it in a quiet place. Sit with it. No words, no goals. Just sit as the flame dances. And if you feel tears rise, do not wipe them away. They are the rain that keeps the flame alive. The lantern is not a thing. It is a choice to keep something beautiful lit, even in the wind. Zen saying. Story 17. The Man Who Waited for the Moon. There was once a man who lived in a stone house at the edge of a mountain forest, where clouds often kissed the peaks and owls called long into the night. His name was Yoru. He was not known for his strength, nor for his wealth or cleverness. He was known for something else entirely. Yoru waited. For what? No one quite knew. He was once a scholar in the capital, fluent in philosophy and mathematics, a teacher of high repute. But one day, in the middle of delivering a lecture on the impermanence of life, he simply stopped speaking. He set down his brush, bowed to his students, and left. No farewell, no letters, just a man walking toward the mountains. Years passed. A rumor bloomed like moss on stone. Yoru is waiting for the moon. Villagers whispered it by fires. Travelers repeated it in inns. The story was always told with a quiet awe, as if not fully understood. Some said he had gone mad. Others said he had seen something in the sky or in a dream that called him. But no one could say for sure. Yoru never explained himself. He built a modest home of stone and pine. Every night, after a simple supper, he would walk to a nearby ridge and sit there until the moon rose. He'd stay long into the night, still as a statue, watching it as though it might speak if he remained silent enough. Then one day, a young monk from the valley temple came seeking him. His name was Etsu. He had heard the tale and, like many others before him, wanted to know the truth behind it. He climbed the winding trail to Yoru's home and bowed deeply. "Master Yoru," he said, "may I sit with you?" Yoru looked at the young monk with eyes like still water. "If you do not mind silence," he replied. That evening they sat together on the ridge. The moon was late in rising. Hours passed in quiet. Etsu squirmed, shifted, watched the sky. Finally he asked, "What are you waiting for?" Yoru did not answer. The moon peeked over the horizon, pale, round, radiant. Still, Yoru said nothing. After it climbed a little higher, Yoru stood up, dusted off his robes, and walked back to his house. Etsu followed. That same pattern continued for nights on end. Etsu would join him, they would sit, the moon would rise, Yoru would return home. He never offered explanation, never spoke of his vigil. After 2 weeks, Etsu couldn't bear it any longer. "Master," he said one night before the moon had risen, "forgive me, but I must know. What are you truly waiting for? The moon rises whether you are here or not. It asks nothing, it says nothing. Why do you wait for it so faithfully?" Yoru turned to him, not annoyed, not amused, just present. "Have you ever waited without wanting something to come?" he asked. Etsu blinked. "I don't understand." "That's why you do not see." He said no more. The next day, Etsu packed his things, confused, disappointed. Perhaps Yoru was indeed mad. Yet he couldn't shake something in the old man's words. Time passed. Etsu returned to the temple. He continued his studies. He meditated. He chanted. He served tea to visitors and raked the dry garden. But something had changed. He began noticing how often his actions were tinged with expectation. When he meditated, he hoped for peace. When he served tea, he longed for praise. When he was alone, he yearned for clarity.
Even his questions to the world were demands in disguise. Years passed. One night, after a long sitting, he found himself walking. His feet led him up the mountain path again. The stars were sharp in the sky. The moon was rising, slow, patient, undisturbed by any desire. When he reached the ridge, he saw the stone house. It was quiet. The door was ajar. He stepped inside. Yoru sat by a candle, older now, frail but still grounded like an old tree. Etsu bowed low. "I'm not here to ask anymore," he said. Yoru smiled, almost imperceptibly. Together, they walked out to the ridge and sat in silence once again. No words, just wind, leaves, and the slow ascent of moonlight. This time, Etsu did not look for meaning. He simply waited. Not for the moon, not for enlightenment. Just waited, like a river waits for nothing and yet holds all things. Zen Parable. A student once asked his master, "What is the way?" The master replied, "Every morning the sun rises. Every night the moon follows. Do you walk, or are you always running?" Philosophical reflection. In a world driven by goals, achievement, and the constant reaching for more, the art of waiting without expectation becomes a radical act. Yoru's quiet ritual was not about astronomy or mysticism, but about alignment with what is, rather than what should be. Waiting without desire is not passive. It is deeply active in a different way, an internal tuning to presence. It says, "I will be here, fully, even if nothing arrives." In that space, miracles happen, not because we summoned them, but because we finally became still enough to see what was always there. Psychological insight. Modern psychology often warns against over-identifying with outcomes. Chronic anticipation can become anxiety, and the endless chasing of results can lead to burnout, depression, and disconnection. Yoru's story models a powerful counterpoint, the healing potential of non-striving. This state, explored in mindfulness-based therapy, creates space for observation without interference. For individuals recovering from trauma or chronic stress, cultivating this waiting mind helps rewire the nervous system, inviting calm, resilience, and deep acceptance. The moon becomes a symbol, not of change, but of constancy that does not depend on us. Meditative closing. Tonight, perhaps you too can sit without a purpose. Find a quiet spot. Feel the breath move in and out like waves. Let go of needing anything to arrive. Ask yourself gently, can I wait, not for something, but simply wait? In the space between breaths, you may find a stillness that has been waiting for you all along. As the moon once whispered to Yoru, "I do not come to teach. I come to be seen, if you are ready." Story 18. The Clay Jar. The storm arrived quietly. It began with the sound of wind brushing against the monastery's high bamboo walls, then the soft patter of rain like footsteps on dry earth. By nightfall, it roared like an old beast, howling through the pines, shaking shutters and bending trees. The monks lit lanterns and sat in stillness as the rain fell, uninterrupted, for 3 days and 3 nights. On the 4th morning, when the clouds finally parted, the young monk Ryota stepped into the garden. What had once been a simple and perfect arrangement of moss, stones, and white gravel was now a mess of mud and broken branches. Ryota sighed. He had raked this garden every morning for 2 years. It was a practice of stillness, of rhythm, of humility. But now it was chaos. And though he knew this, something deeper twisted inside him, a bitterness toward the rain. He bent down and picked up a piece of shattered pottery. It was from the old clay jar the abbot had placed in the center of the garden, a jar no one was allowed to move. Ryota stared at the fragment. It was smooth, once part of the curved belly of the jar. He remembered how it caught the morning light, how birds sometimes perched on its rim, how it had stood quietly through seasons, holding nothing but air. Now it was ruined. Back inside, the monks gathered to clean, repair, and sweep what they could. But Ryota could not shake the feeling that something sacred had been lost. That evening, after the zazen session, Ryota approached the abbot. "Master," he said, bowing low, "the clay jar is broken." The abbot looked up. "Yes. Should we repair it or replace it?" The abbot smiled, then looked out the window toward the darkening garden. "Leave it," he said. Ryota hesitated, "But the garden feels incomplete without it." The abbot nodded slowly. "Then perhaps that incompleteness is your teacher now." A Zen tale, The Cracked Bowl. Long ago, there was a poor man who carried water for a wealthy merchant. Every day, he walked to the river with 2 large clay bowls slung across his shoulders. One bowl was whole and strong. The other had a crack that leaked water with every step. The cracked bowl felt ashamed. "I am useless," it said to the man. "I lose half my water before we even return." But the man only smiled. "Look closely on your side of the path tomorrow." The next day, the cracked bowl noticed a trail of wildflowers blooming along the path, only on its side. "I planted seeds there," said the man. "You watered them every day without knowing. You thought you were broken, but you've made the world more beautiful." Philosophical reflection. There is a hidden cruelty in our longing for perfection. We think the perfect garden must remain undisturbed. The perfect jar must remain unbroken. The perfect self must never falter. But life moves like the wind and the rain. It rearranges our order. It breaks the things we hold dear. And in that breaking, something new is often revealed. Ryota clung to the image of a perfect garden because he believed peace was in the control. But peace is not control. It is presence. The jar was not sacred because it was whole. It was sacred because it stood, day after day, reminding the monks to see stillness in form. Now, broken, it reminded Ryota to see stillness in loss. We are all cracked bowls. We are all vessels that leak and spill. But perhaps in those cracks, wildflowers grow. Perhaps the path of our lives is not meant to be clean, but colored by the unnoticed beauty we leave behind. The storm did not ruin the garden. It invited Ryota into a new one where order is replaced by surrender, where perfection gives way to humility, and where the broken pieces become the most honest teachers. Psychological reflection. Modern life teaches us to fear damage. From childhood, we are told to fix what's broken, to erase what's imperfect, to hide what leaks. We scroll through curated images, speak in filtered tones, and carry silent shame for the parts of ourselves that do not shine. But the psyche, like the clay jar, is not meant to be unbroken. We all experience storms, trauma, failure, betrayal, loss. These events crack our sense of safety, fracture our identity, scatter the calm garden we tend. And in the aftermath, we long for repair. But what if the healing does not mean restoration? What if the jar is not meant to be glued, but honored in its brokenness? Therapists often speak of post-traumatic growth, the capacity to become stronger, deeper, and more compassionate after suffering. The scars are not signs of failure. They are evidence of having lived. They are entry points into empathy, creativity, and meaning. The broken jar in the garden, like the cracked bowl in the tale, reflects this truth. What seems useless may carry quiet gifts. Your tears may have watered someone's blooming. Your silence may have softened another's rage. Your surviving may have given someone hope. In therapy, we do not aim to fix people into perfection. We help them sit with their cracks, to trace them with gold like kintsugi, to see that their brokenness is not the end of their story, but the place where their soul becomes visible. Meditative ending. Close your eyes. Breathe in slowly, as if you are drawing in the scent of wet earth after a storm. Breathe out gently, as if exhaling years of holding things together. Now imagine a garden, simple and wild, a jar, cracked and resting, no longer an object, but a reminder. What part of you have you deemed ruined? What piece of your life have you tried to hide away? Can you, just for a moment, let it be seen? Can you sit with the discomfort of the imperfect, not to fix it, but to honor it? Repeat quietly in your mind, I am the cracked jar. I hold nothing, and that is enough. I am the broken bowl. I spill beauty I cannot see. Let the breath be your gentle broom. Let silence be the rain that clears the path. Let this moment be your garden. And if your heart still aches, let it ache. Even the storm bows to the soil it nourishes. Story 19. The Lantern That Does Not Burn. In the remote hills of Bhutan, there was a monastery so small it did not have a name. It stood quiet against the wind, nestled among pine trees that hummed songs older than memory. This monastery had no gate, no guards, no wealth, only stillness. It was here that a young monk named Tenzin swept the same path every morning with the same old broom, as if he were clearing dust not just from stone, but from the soul itself. Tenzin had been orphaned during the monsoon floods that swallowed his village when he was a child. A passing elder had carried him up into the mountains, saying, "Let the wind raise this boy now." He was raised among silence, among bells that rang not for celebration, but for awakening. But unlike his peers, Tenzin was not interested in enlightenment. He was interested in approval. He wanted the old master to look at him one day and say, "You are the wisest among us." He wanted the villagers who came up for blessings to whisper, "That boy, he will become the next great teacher." He wanted recognition, not realization. And so he worked harder than all the others, not out of devotion, but out of hunger to be seen. One evening, as winter pressed its breath against the wooden walls, the master called Tenzin into the prayer hall. "I have a task for you," the master said, eyes soft, voice calm. "Yes, master," Tenzin straightened, alert. "There is a village at the base of the southern cliff. A woman there is dying. She has asked for someone to recite the Sutra of Radiant Release by her side. Take this lantern," the master handed him an unlit clay lantern, "and go tonight." Tenzin looked at the lantern. "It isn't lit, master." The master only smiled. "Not all light is seen." Confused but eager to impress, Tenzin bowed and set off down the path. The sky was moonless, the forest path thick with shadows. The lantern, even when he tried to light it with his flint, refused to hold a flame. Still he carried it, muttering the sutra quietly to himself as he descended. Halfway down the path, he stumbled upon a crying girl. Her leg was twisted unnaturally. She had fallen from a tree while collecting wood. "Help me," she sobbed. Tenzin hesitated. The village was still far. The woman might be dying this very moment. The master had given him a task. If he failed it, he might never be trusted again. He bit his lip. "I will send help later," he whispered, and hurried on. The wind howled as if disapproving. Later, he passed an old man slumped against a rock, shivering. "Please," the man rasped, "just stay beside me for a moment. I fear I won't make it through this night." But Tenzin kept walking. "I must complete the master's request," he told himself, more urgently now, one task at a time. When he reached the village, the woman had already passed. The family welcomed him politely. They offered him rice. He ate without tasting it. On the way back, the crying girl was gone. The old man, too. Only the cold wind remained. When he returned, dawn was beginning to bleed into the sky. The master stood outside, sweeping the same steps Tenzin had swept countless times. "I have returned," Tenzin said. "I see that," the master nodded. "Did you carry the lantern?" "Yes, it wouldn't light." The master nodded again. "And did you meet anyone along the way?" Tenzin hesitated. "Yes, a girl who had fallen, an old man. But I thought the sutra was more urgent." The master set the broom aside. "Tenzin, the dying woman had already been released from her suffering before you even left the monastery." Tenzin's heart began to pound. "Then why did you send me?" "I did not send you to light her path. I sent you to see if your own light could guide the way." The young monk felt the words slice cleanly through him. "You carried a lantern that would not burn," the master continued, "because it was never about flame. It was about what you would do with it in darkness." Tenzin dropped to his knees. "You passed by two souls who needed you, not because you are a monk, but because you are human." And then the master said nothing more. That night, Tenzin did not sleep. He sat outside the temple, beside the lantern. The wind had softened. Somewhere far off, a single bird called, not in song, but in presence. From that day on, Tenzin changed. He no longer swept the path with urgency, but with awareness. When villagers came, he didn't rush to show them his wisdom, but listened with the stillness of a mountain. And when no one was looking, he visited the girl and her healed leg. He helped the old man repair his roof. He smiled more, spoke less. Years later, the master passed quietly during meditation. The monks gathered, wondering who would now lead them. Tenzin said nothing. He simply continued sweeping. Eventually, no one asked anymore. They just followed the quiet man with the empty lantern and the open eyes. Zen parable reflection. In an old Chinese tale, a monk crosses a river in a small boat. Suddenly, another boat crashes into his from the fog. He becomes furious, ready to shout, but then sees the other boat is empty. The anger dissolves. He realizes the anger was always within him. The boat merely revealed it. Philosophical commentary. The true light is not what we carry in our hands, but what we offer in presence. A lantern that does not burn may still illuminate. The ego seeks recognition. The heart seeks connection. When we let go of the idea of doing good, we simply become good by nature. The master knew, to test a lantern's light, place it in darkness. Psychological reflection. Tenzin's journey reflects the inner struggle many face between achievement and authenticity. The need for approval can cloud our ability to see real human needs. In psychology, this mimics the tension between extrinsic motivation and intrinsic empathy. True healing and wisdom arise not from completing tasks, but from choosing presence over performance. Meditative closing. Take a moment now. Imagine you are walking in darkness with an unlit lantern. Who around you might need your light, even if it does not burn? Let this silence be your teacher. The light of the world is not always fire. Sometimes it is simply someone who stays. Story 20. The Bird That Forgot Its Song. In a small monastery nestled between rolling meadows and thick pine forests, there lived a monk named Elder Haku. He was known for his serene presence, soft steps, and the hauntingly beautiful flute melodies that often drifted through the misty valleys at dawn. Birds would gather near his hut each morning, drawn by the sweet echo of his bamboo flute. It was said that even the wind would pause to listen. But one spring morning, the music stopped. Elder Haku, once so full of quiet joy, now sat still before the altar, his flute untouched beside him. The trees bloomed as usual, the sun rose faithfully, but the birds chirped less, as if waiting for the note that never came. Young Chika, a novice monk, noticed the silence first. She had admired Elder Haku since the day she arrived at the monastery. To her, he had always embodied everything Zen meant: calmness, grace, and inner stillness that flowed like a river. One morning, she approached him as he sat by the koi pond, gazing into the water. "Elder," she said gently, "I miss your music." He looked at her with eyes that had grown distant. "I have forgotten the song," he whispered. Chika frowned. "But you played by heart. It was never the same song twice." "That is the song I have forgotten," he replied, "the one that comes from the heart."
And with that, he rose and walked away, leaving Chika to ponder what it meant to forget something that had never been written. The Zen Parable. Many years ago, there was a forest bird whose song could move even the coldest stones. Her notes were not taught nor inherited. They emerged from her being like wind through hollow bones. She sang each dawn to the sun and every evening to the moon. Animals gathered, trees leaned in, even storms would soften when they heard her. But one day she met a nightingale from another land. The nightingale sang with perfect technique, each note refined and rehearsed. The forest bird listened in awe. "Teach me your song," she begged. The nightingale agreed, and for weeks the forest bird learned to mimic the polished notes. She practiced every day, shaping her voice into the perfect echo. But when she tried to sing again at dawn, the forest went still. The animals did not come. The wind passed through her feathers, but the song would not flow. She had not just forgotten her song. She had abandoned it. Philosophical reflection. Elder Haku's silence mirrors a moment all seekers encounter. The quiet after striving, when all learned techniques fall away, and the soul is asked to speak without scripts. But what if, in the pursuit of mastery, we begin to imitate rather than express? What if our spiritual path becomes so refined that it forgets its raw roots? Zen warns us of this subtle shift, from being to performing, from experiencing to conceptualizing. True practice is not found in the precision of form, but in the courage to remain vulnerable, to allow the unscripted self to rise, even if it trembles. The bird in the parable did not merely lose her voice. She lost her trust in her own nature. In trying to perfect herself, she silenced what was already whole. So too with us. In the effort to do better, we often discard what is most true. Psychological commentary. From a therapeutic lens, Elder Haku's condition resonates with what modern psychology might call spiritual disconnection or symbolic burnout. Often, the most sensitive individuals, artists, healers, monks, face inner collapse not from trauma, but from a slow erosion of authenticity. They become so enmeshed in the role they play that they lose access to their inner source. We learn patterns of behavior, adopt ideals, follow teachings, and in time we may excel in them. But excellence without emotional congruence is hollow. The moment our expression becomes detached from our inner truth, even the most beautiful act becomes performance. Elder Haku's grief is not about forgetting technique. It is about the grief of no longer feeling real in what once felt sacred. To heal, one must not return to the old song, but to the rawness before songs existed, the space where silence lives. Meditative closing. One misty morning, as the sun barely crested the hills, Elder Haku returned to the pond. Chica watched from a distance as he picked up his bamboo flute. He did not raise it to his lips. Instead, he listened. He closed his eyes and listened to the wind rustling through pine needles, the distant chirp of a lone sparrow, the ripple of koi against still water. He let the world compose its own song within him. And then he exhaled, not through the flute, but through his breath. A tone emerged, not perfect, not melodic, but alive. He brought the flute to his lips, not to play what he knew, but to echo what he now felt. And the song returned, not as memory, but as presence. Closing quote for contemplation. When the song becomes about the singer, it is lost. When the singer becomes the song, it is found again. Meditation prompt. Sit for 5 minutes in silence. Close your eyes. Do not search for a mantra or breath pattern. Simply notice what sounds rise around you. Then ask gently, what song have I forgotten? Listen not for an answer, but for the space the question opens.
Story 21. The Lantern That Burned Without Flame. In the ancient village of Yamadera, where stone steps wound endlessly up the mountain like the spine of an old dragon, there lived a lantern maker named Naoki. His hands were calloused, precise, and steady. Each paper lantern he crafted was considered a blessing. Villagers believed that his lanterns never went out, not even in storm winds. They said they held more than fire. They held intention. Naoki, however, never lit a lantern himself. He built hundreds, delivered them to shrines, designed them for weddings and deaths. Yet he had never once ignited a single flame inside his creations. When asked, he would smile and say, "I leave the fire to others." But no one truly knew why. Until the day of the winter solstice. That year, the temple monk asked Naoki to create a sacred lantern, one to be placed at the peak of the 1,000-step staircase, where it would burn through the longest night of the year, guiding lost souls to rest. Naoki accepted. He spent weeks selecting the perfect washi paper, trimming it with red lacquer, painting the outline of a Bodhi leaf on every panel. He carved its frame from driftwood he had found after a typhoon. It was, everyone said, the most beautiful lantern he had ever made. But when the time came to carry it up the mountain and light it, he hesitated. At the 800th step, he stopped walking. The monk beside him paused too. "Naoki," the monk said, "you look pale." Naoki stared at the lantern in his hands. It trembled. "I cannot go further," he whispered. "Why?" Naoki looked up, eyes glistening. "Because I once lit a lantern, and everything burned." The Zen Parable. A young man once asked a Zen master, "Why does light bring both safety and danger?" The master took him to a cave where fireflies danced in the dark. "These lights harm no one," the master said. He then lit a candle. "In this light you can read." He then added oil. "In this light you can cook." Then he knocked over the lantern. The fire spread rapidly, catching dry leaves and climbing to the trees. The young man screamed and tried to put it out, but the master stopped him. "Do you see now?" he asked. "I only see destruction." The master replied, "Then you are halfway to wisdom. The other half is knowing that even destruction carries the seeds of illumination." Philosophical reflection. Naoki's refusal to light the flame reveals a core dilemma on the path of healing, the fear of one's own power. Many spiritual practitioners, artists, or healers carry not just trauma, but a memory of the impact their presence once had on others, sometimes unintentionally harmful. In Zen, flame symbolizes awareness. It can illuminate or consume, depending on how it is held. Some, like Naoki, withdraw from lighting their inner fire because of past devastation. They choose safety over presence, but presence denied is not peace, it is paralysis in disguise. Zen does not ask us to avoid fire, nor to be reckless with it. Instead, it teaches us to hold it with reverence, acknowledging both its warmth and its risk. The lantern without flame is like wisdom without embodiment, beautiful but inert.
Psychological reflection. In psychological terms, Naoki suffers from what might be called functional inhibition due to trauma memory. His avoidance of lighting lanterns stems from an unresolved emotional imprint, one that associates ignition with loss or destruction. This is common among survivors of emotional harm. They avoid stepping into their gifts, creativity, leadership, intimacy, not because they lack talent, but because they unconsciously fear repeating harm. Even if the harm was accidental, even if the context has changed. Naoki's craftsmanship becomes his coping strategy. He can build light for others, but never hold it for himself. This split between capacity and embodiment is what prevents full integration. Healing does not mean erasing the past, but re-entering the flame with conscious breath. Back to the story. Naoki sat on the 800th step, holding the lantern as if it were a fragile life. The monk sat beside him, saying nothing. Finally, Naoki spoke. "I once made a lantern for my wife. She asked for one that would glow all night while she gave birth to our first child." His voice trembled. "I made it too large, too ambitious. I used a new type of oil. I wanted it to burn longer than ever before." He paused, then continued. "But something went wrong. The paper caught fire. The house burned. My wife, my son." His words dissolved into wind. The monk placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did not light the fire with hatred." Naoki shook his head. "But it burned all the same." The monk closed his eyes. "Then light this one with grief. Light it with what remains. Light it not because you're sure, but because you're still here." Naoki stared at the monk. Then, with trembling fingers, he reached for the matchbox. Meditative closing. That night, the lantern stood atop the final step, glowing in the mountain wind. It did not flicker. It did not falter. Naoki stood beside it, watching the flame sway within the paper walls he had built. And for the first time in many years, he did not feel like a danger to the world. He felt real. He did not return to his old self. He became something new, a man who knew the fire and chose to carry it anyway. Closing quote for contemplation. "When you fear your own light, the world loses its way. Light it anyway, even if it trembles." Zen saying. Meditation prompt. Sit in a dim room. Place a single candle before you. Do not light it immediately. Watch it. Notice the potential it carries. Then, when ready, light it slowly and whisper aloud. "I forgive the fire for what it once destroyed. I accept the flame as part of my becoming." Let the candle burn for 5 minutes as you breathe with it. Story 22. The River That Waited. There was a quiet valley nestled between the old hills of a forgotten land. In this valley, a silver river wove its way gently through groves of willow trees, whispering to rocks, reeds, and dragonflies alike. Locals called it the Waiting River. No one remembered how the name came to be. Perhaps it had always waited, for something or someone. On the southern bend of this river stood a modest hermitage built from bamboo and clay. It belonged to a monk named Ryokan. He was not known for his teachings in temples, nor for holding gatherings under trees. In truth, most people thought he had vanished from the world, and perhaps he had. Ryokan had once been a scholar in the city, a man of talent, beloved for his poems and praised for his lectures on Buddhist sutras. Yet at the height of admiration, he walked away, without farewell, without anger, just silence. Years passed. The valley grew lush, the river steady. Ryokan aged like a stone shaped by water, softened but never broken. He rose with the mist, sat beside the river, sipped boiled roots, and spoke to the stars. His silence became a melody only the earth knew. But one autumn morning, a young woman came walking along the river path. Her sandals were worn, her eyes red from nights without sleep. Her name was Yuna. She found the old monk sweeping leaves near the bend. "Are you the one they call Ryokan?" she asked. "I am only a man with a broom," he replied. She bowed low. "They said you once knew many answers." "I have forgotten most of them," he said, smiling faintly. "Then maybe," she said, "you remember the right ones." Ryokan leaned his broom on a rock and gestured for her to sit by the river. So began her stay. The story she carried. Yuna had come not just with worn sandals, but with a burden that pressed against her chest like wet cloth. She had once been a calligrapher, famed in the capital. Her scrolls, written in brushstrokes like breath, adorned temples and scholar halls. But her fame brought jealousy. A fellow artist accused her of forgery, of copying the sacred Heart Sutra without mastery. Though innocent, her reputation shattered. Commissions dried up, friends vanished. Even her teacher, whom she trusted like a father, turned away. "I hated him," she told Ryokan one night, seated by the fire. "I hated the man who accused me. I hated my teacher for abandoning me. I hated my own hands for not being strong enough to fight it." Ryokan fed another stick into the flames. "And now?" he asked. She sighed. "I feel nothing, not even hatred, just exhaustion, emptiness. I'm like a river that's stopped flowing." He nodded, then said only, "Even a river that seems still may be waiting." The Tale of the Silent Bell. One evening, Ryokan told Yuna a story. "There was once a temple high on Mount Ikeno," he began, "where a great bronze bell hung in the bell tower. It had not rung for 100 years. Monks believed the bell had grown silent with time, that its voice had died. One day, a child monk visited. He stood under the bell, touched its base, and said, 'You are not silent. You are only waiting to be touched with the right intention.' He struck the bell gently, not with force, but with presence, and the valley heard a sound not of metal, but of sky and water." Yuna looked up. "What happened to the boy?" "No one remembers," Ryokan said, "but some say the bell still rings, once a year, when the wind is clear and someone truly listens." Yuna closed her eyes and asked, "Am I the bell or the boy?" "You are the space between them," he whispered, "that which makes both possible." Letting go of the brush. On the 7th morning, Ryokan handed Yuna a brush. "I cannot," she said, retreating as if from fire. "You already are," he said. He gave her no ink, only a bowl of river water. "Dip it and write on the stone." She did. Hesitant strokes at first, then bolder. The water disappeared into the rock, leaving no trace, only a dark shimmer that faded within seconds. "What's the point?" she asked. "Ah," Ryokan said, "you have just written the rarest form of calligraphy, the kind that leaves only memory." Yuna tried again, and again, until her hand no longer trembled, until the fear of permanence disappeared, until her movement became like wind brushing against a reed, silent, sure, soft. She began to smile. The Parable of the Empty Boat. On her final morning, Ryokan took her out onto the river in a small boat. Long ago, he said, there was a man meditating in a boat on a foggy lake. Another boat came drifting toward him. He shouted, but the boat did not turn. It struck his own. He stood, angry, ready to curse, but then saw the boat was empty. There was no one to blame, he continued, and so he laughed. His anger disappeared. Are we all empty boats? Yuna asked. No, Ryokan said gently. We are boats filled with shadows, pretending to have captains. But when we learn to let go, when we drift without grasping, we become light. The boat turned with the current. Neither of them rowed. Yuna felt for the first time a deep breath that did not ache.
Return to the city. Weeks later, Yuna left the valley. She did not return to the old calligraphy halls or temples. Instead, she taught young children how to hold brushes, not to impress, not to sell, but to move with the breath of the world. Her students learned how to write poems on wet stones, in the sand, in air. She taught them the calligraphy of impermanence. One day, an old rival passed by her village and saw children dancing, tracing words in the wind. He asked her, "What are they writing?" She smiled. "Gratitude." "To whom?" "To the river that waited," she said. Closing reflection. The river, you see, never stopped flowing. It waited for her to come, to soften, to forget, to remember. Just like all of us, sitting quietly by the banks of time, thinking we are broken, when in truth we are simply waiting for the silence to hold us again. Meditation prompt. Close your eyes. Imagine a river. You are not beside it, you are within it. Let all the names you carry drift away, your successes, your failures, your grief. Say to yourself gently, I am the current. I am the waiting. I am the bell that rings without sound. Now breathe. Let the water carry you. Let go. Let flow. Story 23. The Garden of Stones. In a small, quiet village nestled beneath the snowy ridges of the Himalayas, there lived an elderly monk named Ryatetsu. He was a man of few words, a man whose presence calmed tempests of emotion in those around him. People would travel for days to sit with him, not to ask for advice, but to share silence in his garden, a peculiar place filled with carefully arranged stones. The garden was not lush with flowers or koi ponds, but composed entirely of smooth, weathered stones of every size, shape, and shade. Some visitors expected something more vibrant, but what they found instead was a stillness that grew louder the longer they stayed. Children were told not to move the stones, and adults instinctively followed that same rule, for something about the placement of each one felt sacred. Ryatetsu did not speak of the garden's meaning. When asked, he would simply smile and pour tea. One winter, a young woman named Hana came to the village, wrapped in sorrow and exhaustion. She had lost her son to illness the year before and had been wandering ever since, her grief unable to settle. She did not sleep, she barely spoke. The world, once full of promise and brightness, had dimmed to gray. Hana arrived at Ryatetsu's temple by accident, or so she thought. She had intended to continue south, but a storm blocked the mountain pass, and she was taken in by the village for shelter. The townspeople directed her toward Ryatetsu, saying only, "He doesn't heal wounds, but he shows you where they are." When she arrived at the gate, Ryatetsu bowed and led her silently to the garden. He offered her a mat and a cup of tea, and together they sat without words. The first time, she stayed for an hour. The second day, 2. On the third, she wept quietly without knowing why. Ryatetsu said nothing. Over the next weeks, she kept returning to the garden. Some days, she hated it, how barren it was, how it seemed to demand her attention without reward. Other days, she found her breath slowing, her shoulders dropping, her pain softening just enough to feel it fully. Then one morning, Ryatetsu finally spoke. "Would you like to move a stone?" Hana looked at him in surprise.
I thought we must never disturb the garden." He smiled. "It is not about disturbing, it is about understanding." She hesitated, then stood and wandered the paths. She came to a small gray stone, no larger than her hand, and felt an inexplicable pull. She picked it up gently and placed it a few feet to the left, where a depression in the earth waited, as if expecting it. Ryatetsu nodded. The next day, she moved another. This became a ritual, 1 stone a day. Sometimes she would carry it across the garden, other times she would simply rotate it. Each movement felt meaningful, even if she couldn't say why. As she moved the stones, memories began to return. Of her son's laughter, of warm meals in their tiny kitchen, of lullabies sung to the rhythm of rain. Her grief didn't leave, but it changed shape. It no longer smothered her. It became something she could hold, something she could carry. One day, she asked Ryatetsu, "Why do the stones matter?"
He responded, "When the heart breaks, the pieces scatter. This garden helps us find where they fell." She nodded, understanding not with her mind but her breath. As spring approached, Hana knew it was time to leave. Before she departed, Ryotetsu handed her a single black stone. "Take this with you. When sorrow returns, place it somewhere new. Let the world be your garden." Hana bowed deeply. She walked down the path and into her life again, not free of grief, but not imprisoned by it either. Zen parable. A student once asked a master, "How do I let go of my sadness?" The master replied, "By not grasping it so tightly." The student asked, "But if I do not grasp it, won't it float away like a leaf in the wind?" The master placed a pebble in the student's hand. "Hold it, but do not clutch. See that it stays with you, but without pain." Philosophical commentary. This story explores how grief, like all emotions, seeks transformation rather than elimination. The stone garden becomes a metaphor for internal arrangement, how we make space for pain, how we integrate memory and meaning. Each stone represents a moment of love, of sorrow, of change. Moving them is not about control, but engagement. In Zen, we learn that the world is not to be escaped, but entered fully. The act of arranging is not about perfection, but presence. Psychological reflection. Modern grief therapy emphasizes what is called continuing bonds, a recognition that healing does not mean forgetting, but forming a new relationship with loss. Hana's journey through the stone garden models this. She moves from paralysis to participation, from numbing to meaning-making. The monk does not preach or intervene. He holds space. This models a powerful therapeutic stance, that of witnessing without judgment. Grief cannot be rushed, but in a mindful setting, it can be honored, and in honoring it, we heal. Meditative closing. Close your eyes. Imagine a garden of stones, each one a moment from your life. Some are heavy, some are light. Pick one up. Breathe. Place it somewhere else. Watch how the garden changes, not by force, but by presence. Grief does not disappear, but it transforms when given space. And so do you. The wound is the place where the light enters you. Rumi. Story 24. The Wind and the Gatekeeper. In a high desert town nestled between two barren ridges, there stood an old monastery unlike any other. It was built with mud bricks the color of faded saffron and decorated with prayer wheels that spun slowly in the dry breeze. The townspeople rarely entered its gate, for they believed it to be inhabited by monks who could speak to the wind. Each evening, the same gust would sweep down the ridge, whispering through the chimes and creaking the wooden slats of the monastery's gate. Some swore it was just nature, but others believed it was a spirit, one who once tried to enter but was never allowed in.
The keeper of the monastery gate was a man named Jin-hai. His robes were always dusted in sand, his beard was the color of the sky at dawn, and his posture held the quiet discipline of a man who had stood in the same place for far too many years. He had not been chosen for his wisdom, nor for his lineage. He had been chosen because, when the prior master passed, the wind had ceased for a moment while Jin-hai had been sweeping the stone path. The monks had taken this as a sign. Jin-hai rarely spoke, but he listened well. To footsteps, to creaking wood, to breath, and most of all, to the wind. One morning, before the sun had risen beyond the eastern ridge, a traveler approached the gate. He wore the garments of a soldier, light armor, travel-stained boots, and eyes that darted like someone used to threats. He looked up at Jin-hai, who stood quietly with both hands on the broom. "I have come to ask for entrance," the traveler said. Jin-hai tilted his head. "What do you seek?" The traveler looked unsure. Not shelter, not food, perhaps an answer or forgiveness. Jin-hai gestured toward the bench just outside the gate. "Sit, the wind is kindest at dawn." The traveler sat, his hand never straying far from the hilt of his sword. After some time, the traveler spoke again. "I killed a man, a rebel. I thought it was justice. But when I returned home, I found his wife and child had taken their own lives. Since then, no fire warms me, no bed lets me sleep. I see them in every shadow." Jin-hai nodded, but said nothing. The wind picked up, brushing dust over the traveler's boots. "I thought this place might have the answer," he continued. "The monks, they're said to know how to cleanse the spirit." Jin-hai looked at the man and asked softly, "Do you wish to forget or to see clearly?" The traveler blinked. "Aren't they the same?" "No," Jin-hai said. "Forgetting is like closing your eyes. Seeing clearly is opening them to what has always been there." The wind rose again, sweeping through the narrow alley between the buildings. "I don't want to carry this anymore," the traveler said, pressing his palm to his chest. "Then you must learn to carry it differently." The traveler frowned. "Is that all the wisdom you have?" Jin-hai smiled faintly. "Wisdom is not a sword to be handed over. It is a mirror. You must be willing to look." The traveler looked away, frustration wrinkling his forehead. "I'm not like you monks. I've lived in the world. I've taken lives. I've broken vows. What could a place like this offer me?" "Wind wears down even mountains," Jin-hai said. "Time softens even stone. The gate has no lock, but only those who are empty enough may pass." The traveler stood abruptly. "Empty? I came with nothing." "No," Jin-hai said gently. "You came with a burden, a story, a sword. You came with yourself." The traveler scowled. "Then I will go." Jin-hai didn't stop him. "You may, but the wind returns." And so he left, his boots crunching the desert soil. Seasons passed. Jin-hai continued to sweep. The gate groaned. The wind whispered. Pilgrims came and went. One winter, as the sun set in crimson behind the mountains, Jin-hai heard a familiar rhythm in the approaching steps. The traveler had returned, older, unarmed, his face weathered not just by sand, but by sorrow. "You again," Jin-hai said with a nod. "I went everywhere," the traveler replied. "Fought in more wars, loved, lost, tried forgetting, tried drinking, tried penance, but I kept dreaming of this gate." Jin-hai motioned to the bench. The man sat. "This time I brought nothing," he said. "No sword, no prayer, no answers." Jin-hai handed him the broom. The traveler took it and began sweeping. Years later, when the old gatekeeper passed quietly in his sleep, the monks placed his body beneath the Bodhi tree inside the courtyard. The wind stilled for a single breath.
The new gatekeeper stood outside, robed, silent, broom in hand. His beard was gray, and his eyes calm. No one knew what he had done before the monastery, only that he listened very well, to footsteps, to breath, and to the wind. Zen parable segment. A young disciple once asked the master, "How can I enter the temple?" The master replied, "Drop what you are carrying." The disciple said, "But I carry nothing." The master said, "Then drop yourself." Philosophical reflection. The gate is not a place, but a threshold within. We long to enter peace, to cross into meaning, but we approach carrying judgment, identity, guilt, and longing. We knock, but the gate does not open, not because we are unworthy, but because we are not yet light enough to pass. What must be let go is not the past itself, but our clinging to its story, our refusal to see it clearly. To be empty is not to forget, but to hold gently with no resistance. The desert wind returns each evening, not to remind us of isolation, but to teach impermanence and rhythm. The gatekeeper teaches without teaching, through silence, patience, and presence. Psychological reflection. Trauma, guilt, and shame often create inner narratives that become our prison. We try to enter peace by avoiding the storm within. But healing does not come through avoidance. It begins when we sit down at the gate and listen, to ourselves, to memory, to the wind of emotion. The sword the traveler carried was not just metal. It was the need to define, to defend, to act. Letting go does not mean condoning past wrongs, but learning to see their layers and consequences without collapsing under them. Psychologically, the transformation happens not when we force an identity shift, but when we surrender our demand for control, our clinging to being right or wrong, and instead show up, present, unarmed. Meditative closing. As the wind rises this evening, listen. Not to the words in your mind, but the breath that passes your lips. The moment before you knock. The silence between thoughts. You are standing at the gate. Let go of the story. Sweep. Story 25. The Garden of Emptiness. The wind drifted softly across the temple courtyard. The sky was veiled in a gentle gray, and the old cherry tree stood motionless, its last few blossoms fluttering on the edge of their final breath. In the garden, an elderly monk named Master Renji sat in silence. His robes were faded, his beard long and white like morning mist, and his back slightly bent from years of bowing, not just in worship, but in humility to the ever-changing nature of the world. Across from him knelt a young woman named Naomi. Her eyes were red from weeping, her fists clenched tightly in her lap. She had traveled from a distant city to this secluded Zen temple after losing her mother, her job, and her sense of identity, all in the span of 3 months. "I feel like everything I built has been taken from me," she whispered, barely lifting her eyes. "I have nothing left. I don't know who I am anymore. I came here because someone told me you teach people how to be empty." Master Renji's lips curled ever so slightly into a smile, not out of mockery, but as one smiles at the first light of dawn after a long storm. "I do not teach people how to be empty," he replied. "Emptiness is not something you become. It is something you uncover." Naomi frowned. "What does that even mean?" Master Renji gestured to the garden. "Come." They walked together in silence. The garden was wild and simple. No grand designs, no ornate fountains, only natural rocks, moss, and the slow breath of nature. "There was a monk here once," he began. "Before this garden grew, it was just a field of stone. He was angry at the world. He had been betrayed, cast out by his family, lost everything. Much like you, he came here to find peace." Naomi listened, skeptical but curious. He wanted to clear the land, Renji continued, so he took a spade and began to dig. Every morning he would dig, sweat pouring down his brow, hoping that if he could make the land pure, something beautiful would grow. Did it work? Naomi asked. Renji smiled. He found more rocks, and more, and more. Every time he dug, the ground gave him another stone. He screamed in frustration. One day, in a rage, he threw the spade and fell to his knees. He shouted to the sky, "Why do you keep giving me stones? I want a garden!" Naomi looked down at the earth beneath her feet. And what happened next? He stopped digging. He sat down, defeated. And for weeks, he did nothing, just sat with the stones. He listened to the wind, the insects, the rain. Slowly, something changed. He began to arrange the stones, not to remove them, but to understand them. Renji knelt and picked up a small rock from the path. He began to see that the very things he had wanted to discard were the foundation of the garden itself. Naomi looked around. The stones were everywhere, but placed with care. Each one felt as though it belonged exactly where it was. "So, you're saying I'm supposed to accept everything that's happened to me?" she said, voice trembling. "No," he said gently. "You are supposed to sit with your stones. Not to throw them away, not to bury them, but to learn what they are made of." She fell silent. The air around her was still, as if even the garden had paused to listen. Renji continued, "Zen is not the path of avoidance. It is the path of inclusion. You say you are empty, but you are not. You are full of grief, rage, longing, and none of those things are mistakes. But if you keep trying to erase them, you will spend your life running from the very things that are calling you home." She swallowed, a tear trailing down her cheek. "I miss my mother," she whispered. "I keep thinking of all the things I never said, all the times I didn't call back. It haunts me." Master Renji nodded. "Then let that grief bloom. Speak to it as though it were a guest in your home. Let it stay as long as it needs. When it is ready to leave, it will, but only if you do not chase it away." They walked further into the garden until they came upon a small pond. The water was dark, but serene. "Do you know what the lotus flower grows from?" he asked. "Yes," she replied quietly. "Mud." "Correct," he said. "The most beautiful thing in the world arises from decay." He sat at the edge of the pond, and so did she. "There's a Zen koan," he said softly. "It says, 'What is your original face before your mother and father were born?'" Naomi tilted her head. "What does that mean?" "It asks, who are you before identity, before titles, loss, expectations, gender, shame, or pride, before the storm. If you can discover that face, not the one you wear in the world, but the one that is simply aware, you will find your way." Naomi breathed deeply. "I don't think I know that face." "You don't need to know it," he said. "You only need to stop covering it." They remained by the pond, saying nothing more for a long time. The quiet did not feel heavy. It felt alive. A bird called out from a tree above them. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang. Later that evening, Naomi found herself sweeping the garden path, not because anyone had told her to, but because it felt right. Each stroke of the broom was deliberate. Each movement was a breath. She noticed, for the first time, how even the smallest stone had its place. And within her, something unclenched. Philosophical commentary. The story of Naomi and Master Renji explores the Zen approach to suffering, not as a problem to be fixed, but as a reality to be integrated. Instead of offering solutions, Zen offers space. It does not rush grief out the door or decorate pain with artificial joy. It asks us to sit with the rocks of our experience and arrange them into meaning. The garden of emptiness is not about void. In Zen, emptiness, shunyata, is full of interbeing. It is the recognition that all things arise in relation. Naomi's grief is not a flaw in her being. It is part of the human tapestry. When she stops resisting it, she finds herself. Psychological reflection. From a psychological perspective, Naomi's transformation reflects the principles of radical acceptance and non-judgmental awareness, both central to modern mindfulness-based therapies like DBT and ACT. Her healing does not come from getting over her loss, but from making space for it. Many of us are like Naomi. We carry invisible stones. In trying to throw them away, we often hurt ourselves more. The path to healing is not erasure, but presence. By allowing the full range of our emotions, we create the possibility of integration, growth, and peace. Meditative closing. Tonight, before you sleep, sit with your own stones. What are you carrying? Do not try to fix it. Do not judge it. Just be with it. Then ask yourself, what is your original face before the world told you who to be? Let the wind answer. Let the garden speak. Let yourself be. As we draw the curtain on this final story, let us sit for just a moment in stillness. If these stories have stirred something within you, peace, questions, longing, or clarity, then know that the journey of the empty boat was never about filling you with answers, but gently reminding you that you are already full. The path is not somewhere far. It begins here, now, in your breath, in your heart. We would love to know, what did these stories bring to you? Which moments echoed in the chambers of your mind? What truths surfaced from the quiet? Take a moment to leave your reflections in the comments. Share what you felt, or perhaps what you still carry with you after listening. If this journey has brought calm to your days or sparked thought in your nights, we kindly ask, like the video to let the stillness ripple outward. Share it with someone who may need a moment of quiet. And follow the empty boat to stay with us as we sail further into stories that soften the soul and awaken the spirit. In this fast world, thank you for slowing down with us. Until next time, may you walk gently, may you breathe deeply, and may your boat always float free.